Hello, good people of YouTube, and sorry to the people who may have been waiting in before and saw this event come up and then go away because I'm human and sometimes I hit wrong buttons on my little controller thing over here. That happens. That happens. It's what happens when you do stuff live.
There you go.
And that was supposed to be a doorbell, not an applause, because I've got my guest, Jason Tong, here. Hey, Jason.
Hey, Rick. How you doing, man?
Mate, I am doing fine and dandy. It's good to get these little technical things out of the way straight up, and then we forget about things and just have a bit of a chat, and hopefully it goes smooth sailing from here on in.
Yeah, man, absolutely.
So, Jason, as I said to you earlier, mate, I've seen you around online for a few years, and was very interested in some of the amps that you were building.
Yeah.
It's all influenced by amps that I'm really into, and I'm going to get into that. But I want to find out first and foremost what sparked the fire for the love of guitar for you, mate.
Yeah, man. Look, for me, I'm probably like most of us that have kind of done this for most of our lives. It happened pretty early. I was fortunate to grow up with two older brothers. I didn't necessarily think I was that fortunate at the time, being the youngest, but what it meant from a musical perspective is that they were bringing music into the house that I wouldn't have otherwise heard or seen or known about, and this was back in the days of when I was born in 1970, right? So you can imagine I'm 10, 11, 12 years old. It's 1980, 81, 82. This is the period. And my oldest brother, Simon's 5 years older than me, and he started to bring home, basically what at the time we were starting to call heavy metal, on vinyl. And it was all, it was kind of in two camps, right? There was a nice building collection of AC/DC that was starting to collect in the household. And then a lot of kind of new wave of British heavy metal stuff, that happened. And my earliest memory really is really gravitating towards early AC/DC and just kind of, because it sounded like nothing I'd ever heard. And my mum and dad had a lot of music in their house, and it was fantastic music, but it wasn't like that. It was, Fleetwood Mac and this kind of stuff, right? It was all very tasteful and played beautifully and all the rest of it, but nothing sounded like that. And I got this probably one of the earliest memories of kind of like guitar itself was hearing Malcolm Young. Actually, I didn't know it was Malcolm, and I remember saying to Simon, my brother, saying, "Oh, that's Angus, right?" And he said, "No, that's the rhythm guitar. That's Malcolm." And I was like, "Oh, wow," And I don't know, man. Just from there, I just had this kind of urge to learn guitar. And at school, there was a musical program at school, and they only had two instruments in the kind of, in the school kind of curriculum, if you like, that I was, and I was like, I was 11, 12 years old at this point. Drums and bass guitar.
Yeah, right.
Right. And there's already a guy playing drums and he's bloody good. So he was like, I'm not doing that. So I started learning bass guitar at school, and like kind of big band. There's big brass bands and some orchestral stuff and so I was doing that during the day at school, but then trying to play Steve Harris riffs at night in my bedroom, and then look, I don't know, by the time I was probably 14, I'd kind of like discovered all this kind of thrash stuff coming out of the Bay Area, and really kind of decided I actually really wanted to play guitar rather than bass guitar.
Cool.
So that's, yeah.
Cool.
Kind of
so you've had an ear for distorted guitar sounds from quite a young age, by the sounds of it.
Yeah, man. And look, it takes time to develop your ear, doesn't it? And I think back then I remember very, very, very early memories of listening to Kiss. Actually, was another band that Simon had brought into the house, and this is much younger. I don't know, 7 or 8 years old, I guess, something like that. So it'd be the late 70s. And I can remember not being able to distinguish the instruments. All I heard was music,
Yeah, right.
hear the vocal, right? I mean,
Yep.
I recognize the songs and the melodies and the words. And then there was just music and drums. And then I think by the time I was 11 or whatever, I could actually start to hear things, and that, again, I go back to the kind of the clarity of those early AC/DC records, which just everything is just right there,
Mm.
and the guitars are panned hard left, hard right, so you can kind of hear. It's not just a wash with layers of stuff, you know what I mean? It's just raw and right there, and yeah, man, that's the sound.
Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah,
I can hear the New Zealand accent. So I'm assuming this is in New Zealand.
yeah, yeah.
Yep. Yeah. What part of New Zealand are you from, man?
Man, I was born in Hamilton
Yep.
and raised. Went to Waikato University, which is based in Hamilton, and then moved up to Auckland. For anyone who doesn't know, the Hamilton's about an hour and a half drive south of Auckland. So it'd be kind of like, I mean, for us down at this part of Australia, it's a little bit like, I don't know, growing up in Geelong and then moving to Melbourne or something.
Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah.
A bit like that. And yeah, moved up to Auckland and was playing in bands up there and that kind of stuff when I was probably 21, 22, something like that. But yeah, big part of my life there. And we moved to Australia before I was 30.
Yep.
Yeah.
So
a long time ago
I've
now.
got my father's side of the family is all from Whakatane, so
Oh, wow.
not too far. Yeah.
Sweet.
Yep. Yeah.
Nice one.
Yeah. So, mate, you were saying you started on the bass.
Yeah.
At what point did you switch to guitar? How old were you when you switched?
Probably 14, somewhere around
14?
there. So there was a guitar in the house. Like I had my bass guitar that I was kind of learning and playing, and then the middle brother Shane, he's also played an instrument, so he was learning guitar, and he had started learning actual classical nylon string guitar. So that was always in the house, So I would pick it up and play it whenever he wasn't around, because if he wasn't around, I wasn't allowed to touch it,
Yeah,
right. And try to figure stuff out or whatever, right? And obviously back then, any of us old enough, we're all old enough to remember getting information and finding out how to play stuff. It just wasn't there, and I started seriously kind of like buying guitar player magazines and all that kind of stuff. But that kind of probably happened more when I was, I don't know, 15, 16, 17, around that time. So at that really early stage, it was just, you're just trying to learn stuff by ear. And then you eventually find a few mates that are trying to learn to play as well. And it just goes from there. So the more I listened to guitar oriented music, and my taste started to becoming more and more guitar oriented. And I mentioned, earlier, kind of getting into early, thrash metal stuff, right? So I remember hearing Metallica for the first time, and I saved up and got Kill 'Em All on vinyl, and you couldn't buy that record in New Zealand. I had to send the money away. I can't remember.
Wow.
A couple of mates. Yeah, me and a couple of mates at school, there was about 3 of us that were into it. I can't remember how it happened, but he did my mate organised like a mail order or something, and international money order, or all that crazy stuff that happened before e-commerce and all that. And we bought these Metallica vinyl records directly from the US, I think, and waited for months, and then they arrived, And so by the time Ride the Lightning came out, you could buy it in the record store. But when Kill 'Em All came out, you couldn't. And that stuff was just like, man, I am playing guitar. Like, that's what I want to do,
Cool. I can remember the first time I heard Metallica. I found it scary. So I was around a similar age. I was 14. I was playing in my first band, and we were playing a school dance. And we had lined up all the PA and everything, production. What we didn't think of was hiring a DJ for in between. So the sound guys just had one tape that they'd play in between.
Oh, God.
And
Yeah.
it was Metallica.
Yeah.
And this is back in 1988. And people hadn't heard that. And
no one had.
the look on people's faces like, what is this? Now, an interesting thing, man, you said about learning by ear, because you're right, we
Yeah.
didn't have internet back then to look up exactly how to play stuff or watch what position people are playing things in. I actually think that was a bit of an advantage to us in finding your own sound, because when there was a flurry of notes that would go past, we would come up with our own approximations of that, not
Mhm.
note perfect like you can now with software to slow things down. And I think people had a lot more individuality in their playing because of that, which is a cool thing. And you said about guitar magazines, learning from those as well. I had crates full of Guitar
Me
Player
too.
magazine, Guitar
Yeah.
World magazine,
Yeah.
Guitar for the Practicing Musician,
Yeah. Had
all
them all.
those. And they were our Bibles. That's how we learned.
Yeah. Yeah. You remember you used to get the those, I don't know what you even call them, but like they were vinyl records.
Sound
They were
page.
floppy.
Sound
Yeah.
page.
Yeah. One of the first ones that I remember getting, and it might have been the Guitar Player magazine, the very first time they released one of those records or whatever. It was Steve Vai, the Attitude song off Flexible.
Yep.
And again, like me and a couple of mates who were learning guitar, this was just, like to hear that blew our minds. Yeah, it's an exciting time, man, because it was like your imagination makes up for the stuff that you don't know or you don't see,
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And even when I revisit some of those old songs and play them, my interpretation as a 14-year-old kid, it's not what they actually played, but it still gave us that individuality, which I think is kind of lacking now when people are shown exactly how to come up with it. And
yeah, I mean, because you end up, I mean, well, certainly I did. This is how I kind of, because I didn't, I mean, my ear developed and I was really stoked with how it did. But there was stuff that I didn't have the time or I guess the will to learn things to the nth degree. It was always, for me, it was like, that's close enough's good enough, like, I mean, I don't mean to hack it up, but I mean like, okay, that's enough. Now I can move on to the next thing. I don't want to be forensic about something and try and spend the next 6 months trying to figure out 1 5-second passage, that I was trying to copy off a record. It was like, no, that's enough. I'll move on,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, mate, what was your first guitar? You said when you're 14, you switched from bass.
Oh, man. Yeah. So me and my brother Shane, right, who Shane and I ended up playing in bands together for a long time through our kind of, well, through our teenage years and into our early 20s. We went halves, so we saved up and we went halves. It was a Hondo Strat, and it was a fucking piece of shit. Oh my God, that guitar. Even I knew it was bad, and I couldn't play for shit, like this thing, it was a Strat copy, 3 single core pickups. It was kind of like an orangey, peachy kind of orange color. And it was literally the cheapest guitar in the store, because that's, it's like $200 or something.
Yeah.
$100 each or something like that, It was just God knows how many owners it had had before us. And it wasn't beat up or anything, but it was a difficult guitar to play, So that was the first, I think the guitar that replaced that, oh man, I'm trying to remember. It didn't take that long before I got a pretty nice Ibanez. Yeah, and that was like, okay, that was, and it had the edge trim on it and all that, yeah. So that was a serious guitar. I was like, okay, this is nice, yeah.
So had the modification bug hit you? Did you try modding your Hondo Strat or anything like that? Because I've got some rippers that I did some modding.
But I did mod that Ibanez. It was this was before the Gem and stuff had come out, before the RG 550 and all that. So they had this range of guitars that I guess predated that, and it that guitar had two single cores and a humbucker in it, and I do remember cutting out the plastic pick guard by hand, and maybe I used a soldering iron a little bit to mount it. I can kind of remember doing this and filing it, and I put a humbucker in the neck, so I had hum single hum. So that was my first mod, was hacking that guitar up and putting a humbucker pickup in it.
I'm laughing because behind me, I've got. Is it up there? Is my chair in the way of it? No, it's not. Where is it? My first Strat. It's over there. I'll go grab it in a sec.
All right. Cool.
Which was an Onyx Strat, because let's face it, everyone was playing Strats back then. And I'd done similar, where I didn't have the appropriate tools, and we tried cutting out cavities to put humbuckers and things, and I didn't have chisels and stuff. I just got a screwdriver and a hammer and was bashing away in there.
Totally.
And man, we even tried putting a cheap Floyd Rose from a really cheap guitar we picked up and drilled some holes in it. There's auto bog around that. I'm going to grab it. Just one second. Let me just switch this up. This is
look at that.
This is all that's left of it. So I've been talking to Charles Cillier actually about restoring this. I've got enough parts, and I'll just get him to do all the rest. But there's...
Oh, man, look at that.
Yeah, bashing it with a screwdriver to cut out the things.
Yeah, man.
Auto bog. This is all backwards.
Oh, man, really? Yeah, look at
to
that.
hold in the tremolo posts on a Floyd Rose. And I've actually been looking for ages for a nice Sunburst Strat to pay homage to this. And it just dawned on me, it's like, why don't I just restore this and put some good parts? I mean, it's a plywood body, but...
The net looks killer.
It's not bad. It's a little narrow. It's only like a 40 mil nut, and I prefer like up to 42-ish. But I'm going to try. I'm going to try getting some parts that I've got lying around on there and seeing what I can do. I even scalloped out the higher frets to be like an Ibanez gem, because I used to see those in the... Yeah,
I didn't notice that, but you have too. Yeah, look at that.
Yeah. What can I say? You make do with what you've got when you're a kid, and just you go for it.
Yeah.
And that was mine. So yeah, Hondo Strat, Onyx Strat, not too far off there.
Yeah.
So you were saying about AC/DC early on there, and how that grabbed you, the sound of it, and being drawn to Malcolm Young's sound. What was it about his sound? Because it is such a clear, not fuzzy and distorted. But
that's right. And at that point in time, I have no idea about how that sound's even been made. All I can remember is hearing it and going, man, I really like it. And I think, looking back on that, it was probably what he was playing more than how it sounded that I liked. Just the sound of that band, what they were doing. And I'm talking about this is, we're obviously in Australia and New Zealand, right? Because New Zealand got the same releases. We had High Voltage and TNT, the first two AC/DC albums, right? Which internationally got kind of rebadged as one release, High Voltage, right?
Yeah, right.
So the TNT album was never released outside of Australia and New Zealand.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And that had that had particular tracks on that are pretty hard to find these days, actually, because you won't find them on Spotify and stuff like that. I mean, over the years, I think AC/DC have put out box sets and other things where all that stuff has been published. But, so it was that. And then you get into, Dirty Deeds and Let There Be Rock and Power Age. It's all that era stuff I'm talking about, because, I mean, the Brian Johnson era stuff, Back in Black's 81, that was just, I guess it had just been released or just come out. I've got this memory of Simon coming home with Back in Black. I do remember that, but we were already listening to AC/DC by that point, So it was probably more what he was playing and just that, I guess, his rhythm playing and the, it's the foundation of their, of what they were doing, I think.
Mate, it's funny hearing you talk about AC/DC. I just remembered that back when I was around that age, my mum buying me an AC/DC poster because it had guitars and stuff on there. And I was actually more into Dire Straits and the Shadows when I first started playing, just really simple stuff to play. And my next door neighbor, older chap, put me onto the Shadows, and that's good for the first 6 months. Help find your fingers. Then Dire Straits, they were all over the TV with that big tour they did of Australia back then, and I was like, whoa, I want to do that. But my mum bought me an AC/DC poster, and I actually returned it because young me was like, oh, that's devil music. Like it had that stigma attached to AC/DC.
It was funny.
Back then.
Like I had, because my dad, big Dire Straits fan, still is, right? And so we had Dire Straits music in the house, and he had 12-inch vinyl records and stuff like that. And that was already being played. That has been played a lot in the house before AC/DC arrived on the scene and stuff like that. So, Mark Knopfler, all that stuff's amazing. And again, like I get this, you're making me think of all these old memories, and I can remember figuring out parts of Sultans of Swing. I could kind of play. I could figure out all the chords and stuff, and I could play some of the lead lines in it.
Yep.
I was still living at home, a teenager or whatever, and still quite young. And I can remember playing it to Dad, and he's like, I can remember him thinking, well, I thought that he was thinking, this whole music thing might be worth doing after all, because they've been driving me around to a few lessons and helping me buy bloody strings or whatever else it is that I wanted, And I remember him sitting there and going, "Oh wow, yeah, this is all right,
Cool."
Yeah.
So you said you started playing with your brother in bands. Were you guys playing pubs and things at a young age?
Yeah. So this was all cover stuff at that point, and we did the usual thing of, there was the first lineups they were all guys at the same high school, and so inevitably you end up playing at the, at the high school social or dance or whatever the hell it was, that kind of stuff. And then my uncle owned a pub actually, just not far out of Tauranga, if you know that part of New Zealand. And we played there a bunch of times. I was well underage, 15 maybe, 16, something like that. Drinking age in New Zealand at that point would have been 20.
Wow.
I guess, yeah. And then, started playing at pubs all around the Waikato, Hamilton, and that kind of stuff, right? So, and that's kind of I think that's where you learn the craft of figuring out how to control a loud amplifier. You know what I mean? Like that, getting out and playing on stage. And, this is all, mostly vocal PAs. Maybe you've got a bit of kick drum going through the PA, perhaps, but it's all off the back line. Like everything the audience is hearing is coming off the stage,
Yep.
Drummers smacking the shit out of their kit, your amp's loud, and you're learning how to interact with that. You know what I mean? Like, it's getting to talk about modeling and all that kind of crap, right? But that's the thing, that if you're just playing a modeler into a PA with in-ears, you don't have any of that.
That's
and
right.
I think it's a tragedy. But anyway.
What amp were you using back then?
Oh man, I had so New Zealand built. So this is back in the day. Obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but back then, importing US made or UK made amplifiers was very expensive, right? So, and I think the same thing happened in Australia, is that you had local builders that sprung up to fill that void. So over here, there were, companies, Strauss and whatever else, there's a whole range of them, right, that popped up and started building tube amps. Well, the same thing happened over in New Zealand, and I had a Rocket combo. It was all tube, and it was, I think it was basically a clone of an early Mark series amp. No graphic EQ on it that I can remember, but it had the look of an early Mark series amp, the combo with the kind of the cane wicker kind of grill cloth thing, like that whole vibe.
Yep.
Yeah, and it was, knowing what I know now and thinking back, I'm pretty sure it was 6L6 powered. It was as loud as hell.
Yeah. Was it a 1x12?
Yeah. Yeah.
Did you ever try plugging that through like external 4x12s or anything like that? Or
No, not the time. I used that for a long time. I had a brief stint with a solid state Laney amp that was a disaster. Just couldn't, just didn't sound anything like, man. That was one of those things where I traded this amp in at a local store and got this new amplifier. And because I was starting to have problems with this tube amp, it would crackle and I'd have to whack the side of it to get it to work. And, like we'd be in the middle of freaking songs, whatever, at the pub, and the guitar would stop working and I'd have to fucking hit the side of this amp. And it was like, it would crackle and like an old TV,
Yeah.
And it would crack and fucking carry on. Then it would come back to life and you'd get through the rest of the set and you're just never knowing when it's going to shit itself again.
Yeah.
And so I traded it in and paid the difference for this Laney solid state. It was a combo as well. Thought it sounded okay in the store, but when I actually kind of really got to play it properly and then tried it with the band and stuff, it just didn't cut the mustard. But you kind of committed by that point.
Sure.
Like, I was just like, I can't remember how old I was. I probably just, I wasn't at university. I still would have been at school. I had no money or anything. And I'd spent the money, man, and there's no way back. And I was like, well, I've got to live with this thing for a while now.
Sure.
And then, then I got eventually, maybe a year later or something like that, I got my first tube head and 4x12. And that was a Laney Pro Tube 50, which was it's a 2204 clone, a JCM 800 2204 clone, single channel amp, gain, master volume, treble middle bass presence, that's it, and a high and low input, and then a 4x12 which had Celestion T75s in it, which I know now, but at the time I didn't think it's just a quad, right? I just plug in and go, and it sounded amazing, like this thing has just had this thump. And I can remember going to the first gig with it, and the guys in the band, I just finally got rid of that bloody combo thing that I had, and I rocked up with this 4x12, and they were like looking at me going, oh my God. And then they heard it, they were just like, holy shit, because it was the bottom end that this thing pushed out compared to what I had been playing was just night and day,
How are your ears from back then? Do you have the whole tinnitus thing? Because mine, I'm really surprised that I can mix. I do a bit of production, and I'm majoring in production at university at the moment. And I can mix, which surprises the fuck out of me because the ringing in my ears, especially my left, is terrible. How's yours, man?
Not awesome. Look, it's I think the same. Like when I listen to music, I can hear. Well, I think I can hear everything in it. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
But if you're conversation with background noise, sometime I'm like, and like around the house here, my partner Kath, who I've been with, over 30 years now. Man, our two kids who are in their early 20s, they're like, "You're deaf." Like, what? No, I'm not.
Yeah. So I have to compensate. I have to turn up the music so I'm hearing beyond the tinnitus is the only compensation. I also have a couple of little speakers that have got a bit more top end than I'd normally use off my NS10s, just to check the top end to make sure that I'm not overdoing that.
Yeah.
But, I've come to realize that a lot of the top mix engineers in the world are actually ex-drummers. And you can't be a drummer, especially from back in the days we used to play, and not have hearing damage.
You couldn't.
No way. Yeah. And I said my left ear is the one that's down, and I reckon that was my band I was in from probably around my early 20s, where we used to rehearse 3 nights a week in a tiny little shed, drummer cymbal was right beside that ear.
That is the killer, man.
That is, yeah. And I reckon that's what did it.
100%.
I reckon I should sue him.
That's it. Cymbals are for anyone who's standing on a small stage, repeatedly in a loud environment. That's the death to ears, man.
Yep. Yeah.
And they're right there, like when you're just doing those kind of, gigs on tight stages and stuff. The cymbals are just right there, aren't they?
Absolutely.
Whatever side, right or left, but they're just right there.
Yeah. So at what point did you start modifying amplifiers and getting into playing with amps?
Much later.
Much later, yep.
Yeah, much later. So at uni, I actually did a physics degree, and I went into applied physics, which means kind of IT and digital and analog electronics. And the focus of that course of study was quite practical, and it was focused on, like universities are, they're much more focused on getting you to understand things necessarily than preparing you for working life. They didn't do that, the focus on, we want you to understand how it works.
Yeah.
They weren't making you ready to go and like get a job, like the next day or anything like that. So, which was good, right? Because when I think back about all that shit that I learned, it stayed pretty dormant in the back of my brain. But then when I did get into this, it all, it was all there to leverage, because I ended up going pretty heavy into computer science and into software engineering, and I started my kind of working life outside of music as a software engineer, cutting code, right? And did that for a while, and then ended up working in IT for until I left to, I don't know, how long ago now? Nearly 2 years, not quite 2 years ago.
Yeah.
To do this full time. So the whole thing, back to your question, I think maybe 10 years ago, give or take, I don't know why I had this urge, but all of a sudden I had this urge to modify a tube amp that I had. Probably because I didn't like the sound of it, and I started just by accident, I'd come across some website that was talking about how you could change these few components and it would transform the sound. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. So I did that just for fun. And I was really surprised at how dramatically the sound of that amp changed just with changing 6 things, like a couple of resistors and a couple of capacitors in the front end. And I was like, holy shit. And so it got me curious, right? And then, a couple of months go by and I'm like, I want to do more of that. So I ended up, the first tube amp I actually built was just a kit. I got a kit from Stereotone, Nick at the Stereotone, and they do it's a good place to start if you kind of want to get into it, because everything you need gets shipped to you in a box.
Sure.
One box. Right down to nuts and bolts and right down to the end resistor and everything. And and I did 2 of those just for learning, right? The first one was like what Marshall had, that lead and bass amp. It was a little 20-watt thing that they put out, 1974 model circuit, I think, from memory. And it was a kit for something like that, which is kind of a real dead simple amp, EL84 powered thing. And it worked first go. I powered it on. It was, wow, incredible, man. And I was like,
were you waiting for it to blow up or something as you hit the button?
Yeah. And I was still kind of like, that was more like build the kit, follow the instructions, rather than go back to basics and understand how the whole thing works. That came after, because it was like once I got kind of interested in it to the point where I'd created something and it worked and it sounded great. I thought it sounded great. And I did another one, which was another Stereotone amp, which was one of their kind of high gain modded plexi things. And again, it worked, and I was like really surprised at kind of how great I thought it sounded. Then I was like, right, I actually want to understand pull this right apart and actually understand how it works. So I just started relentlessly studying this stuff. Every spare moment was spent reading about it on forums or an amp on the. I've got a makeshift workbench set up in the garage, soldering iron and a few basic tools and stuff, and just started playing with shit. And and ever since, that's just been continuous since then. And just once I got into it, I just never stopped.
Wow. That's awesome. But you can do that in this day and age, as much as I said before about learning guitar and not having that individuality through trying to decipher fast licks yourself. You can teach yourself some amazing things online, can't you? Like the equivalent of a university degree.
Yeah, this is right. I mean, there were no, as I said, give or take 10 years ago, and I guess maybe it was probably around 2016, 2017 that I started to really dive into it. And a lot of the information, and some of these websites are still up and running now, right? But they're not on. This is all nothing on Facebook. I mean, I don't even. Facebook was it a thing then? I don't even know. It was all the stuff is on the old bulletin board style forums,
Mm-hmm.
And there's a bunch of them around, like Amp Garage, Slow Clone or SLO Clone forums.com is probably the one of the more infamous ones. Small, very passionate community on there, but some really great info and some guys that moderate that forum. Incredibly knowledgeable and very generous with their knowledge too, actually. And that Slow Clone, for example, forum, which it's pretty quiet now. Like I go and log in occasionally to see what's going on. But back in the day, all of, maybe not all, but a lot of the well-known amp designers were on there. John Suhr, Dave Freeman, the list goes on and on and on. And they're all, some of them were very open with who they were, and others had some avatar or name, whatever, and you couldn't tell who they were, but eventually people figure out who it is,
Yep.
And like Mark Cameron, who's and another very infamous name in the high gain world, was on there in the third person. So he would log in and talk about Mark like he was Mark's buddy.
Yep.
But
it was actually him.
We all knew it was him.
Yeah. That'd
I've
be
been
interesting.
Talking to Mark and blah, blah, blah,
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That'd be so funny to go back and read some of those old posts and just see how he did that. Yeah.
It's all still there. But to that guy, I mean, I'm 99.9% sure it's him, right? I pretty much had it confirmed. Again, but he would, because that forum was kind of a bit underground and not well known, and it's not easy to kind of they used to have a challenge question to register that was never easy. They were not easy questions, so people would often give up and not get in there. You had to be pretty determined to actually get a login and then get into the forum. But he would be pretty open actually about with what Mark was doing, because it was Mark. But.
Yeah. That's gold. That's gold.
Yeah. It's all still there, like that, and and some of those other, the other ones they're all still. They're probably not as much happening, not as much activity these days, but all that information is still there, and they're great reference sites to go back and have a look at. Cool.
So, leading up to you doing that, starting to learn the art of modding amplifiers and everything, did you have some nice amps leading up to that?
Not really, because I'd owned a few things, but I was part of that thing of as maybe a little bit of that DIY spirit. I didn't want to go and pay 7,000-8,000 Australian dollars for an amp that I thought I could do myself for $1,000.
Sure.
That was part of it, I remember, and I've told the story to Dave a bunch of times, right? And I remember I think I mentioned this when Dave had me on Tone Talk, like a long time ago now. There's a video of Phil X demoing the BE100.
Yep.
This is the first gen BE100. It's in Dave's shop, like you can tell because it's got all the red wallpaper and red curtains and all that. So it's in his shop in North Hollywood, and Phil's a ripping player, and he's just like cranking out all these killer Van Halen riffs and stuff, and it sounds amazing. And I remember watching that video on YouTube and thinking, man, that amp sounds fucking awesome. And then I kind of like had a look at what you might pay for one of these in Australia, and I was like, man, that's like a fucking car.
Yeah.
Right. And by that stage, I'd already had maybe I'd built those kits or something at that point, I think, and I kind of like had a little bit of belief that I might be able to do something like that. And that was probably the catalyst for me then moving into building an amp myself, not using a kit, because it's when you buy a kit off someone like Nick at Seriatone, or you might you buy a Plexi kit or a JTM45 kit from Mojo Tone or whatever. There's a number of places you can buy these things from. It's challenging, make no mistake, if you've never done it before, but you've got a booklet of instructions and layout diagrams, and all the parts you need are all there and whatever. If you just go and then, okay, I'm going to build an amp from scratch, even if you're copying someone else's design, it's still a massive challenge if you've never done it before, because you need to figure out what voltages caps you're going to get, what type, what size are they, what transformers are you going to use, and everything it all has to be in spec, otherwise it's not going to work, or it's not going to work optimally, whatever. And that forcing yourself to do that that's when you get up the learning curve, because you start to, over time, doing your research, and again, I was posting a lot on forums back then, asking questions and figuring shit out. You learn all that stuff. But back to the Dave thing, my first amp that I built, which I still have, which was my first turret board build, where I literally got the perforated main board and hammered in all the turrets myself and hand wired this whole thing and sourced all the parts myself, was a Dirty Shirley clone.
Nice.
And that was probably 2017, somewhere 16, 17, somewhere around there. And, that was, so I kind of like, I wasn't going out and spending lots of money on amps, because I just got, when I wanted to expand my collection, I just started building them, and I built a Soldano clone, which I still got, and then I did a 3-channel kind of BE100 style amp that I built myself that I've still got. All these things are sitting on the shelf in the garage. I never play them anymore, but they're still there.
Nice.
Yeah. So, I mean, but more recently, I guess once you kind of start getting into it, I wanted to have some good, decent examples of amplifiers that I love and want. So, like I picked up a 1969 50-watt Plexi just before Marshall moved to middle panel. So it's actually a plexiglass front amp. Some guy in Canberra was selling it.
Wow.
A few years back. So I think, things like that I've added to the collection. I've got a Mark III, Mr. Boogie Mark III from the early 80s. I got a JEL 100. That's my Freeman amp sitting over there. I've got a Sir SL68. I've got a PT15IR. Big fan of what Sir does. I really like that company. But other than that, so a few things there, but most of the stuff that's in here is stuff I've built myself.
Yeah, right. Nice. So when you started coming out with your own line, you started off with kits, right?
Yeah, that's where that's kind of a learning ground, right? You build a few kits to kind of like learn how to do it.
Yeah, but you started selling kits for other people to
build.
Oh, yeah,
no, that was a whole different thing. Yeah. So what happened? Not kits. I started getting into printed circuit board design.
Sure. Yep.
Okay. So this goes back to the kind of the engineering stuff and things that I learned at university that were kind of in the back of my brain and hadn't really been used for a long time. And then, I basically self-taught. I had a guy here in Melbourne who's a friend of mine who became a mentor for me in the very early days, a guy called Don Kohinger, who was already doing his own. So he's an amp designer and builder. So Dave Leslie from the Baby Animals
Yep.
was using Don's stuff, still does.
Okay, is that the Melbourne amplifier?
Yeah,
Yep.
Melbourne Amp Company.
Yep.
Yeah. And Southern Cross Audio was his other brand that he had before he kind of rebranded as Melbourne Amp Company. And Don was one of those awesome dudes that kind of like, he was seeing what I was starting to do, and he said, man, you should get into printed circuit board design. And he said, based on what you've done with IT and shit like that in your background, he said you'll pick it up. And I was like, oh man, that sounds like really challenging. And he said, no man, because he'd already gone through the learning curve. And he said, I'll send you a couple of files just for little small things, and that he said you'll probably find it's enough to get you started. And sure enough, it was. So I started, because I wanted to start to get into doing more sophisticated designs and sophisticated amplifiers with channel switching. Like a single channel amp is one thing. Like you plug in the front, you got a gain, a volume, whatever. They're not dead simple, but they're pretty simple beasts,
Sure.
When you actually then move into going, okay, well, I want a 2-channel amp, the clean channel with its own EQ, a gain channel maybe with a couple of different options, and I want it foot switchable, so I can be out, out front of the stage or whatever and hit a fucking button and it's going to switch my amp. Then you're in a whole different ball game.
Yeah, right.
You've got to understand about relays and switching things remotely. And when you start to understand the components that are required inside the amp to make all that work, you realize they're all PCB mount. Okay. Now, there are amplifier well-known brands actually today that build channel switching amps using components that should be on a printed circuit board, and they're not, which is, I find, crazy, but they do. They take like a relay as like a little, like, this is a USB stick, right? They're sitting on my desk here.
Yep.
This is not a relay, obviously, but a relay is about the same size as this. And they have little pins on them, right? And they're meant to go into a printed circuit board and be soldered in. If you want to use one of these in an amp and you're not using printed circuit board design, what people do is they invert them and they hot glue them into the chassis and then solder to the pins by hand. It's crazy, right? But it works.
Wow.
And I didn't want to do that, right? Because to me, that just like was, it seemed like a hard road. Like it seemed like the right thing to do was to do this properly and apply some engineering into it and actually like create a printed circuit board. And like, people like Dave and others had already cottoned on to this and were already starting to move and transition their build method from eyelet board or turret board into printed circuit board. And there's untold reasons why you do it and why it's a good idea. There's some purists out there that, still go on about hand wired versus PCB, which is...
I've heard that. I didn't really understand why, but I guess I'm learning now.
Yeah. Well, it's just, I don't know, man. I'm trying to think of a good analogy as to why I don't think it's a good idea at all. I mean, look, printed circuit board based amplifiers probably got a bad reputation from some of the very early use of printed circuit boards. So Marshall, the most famous of brands, transitioned to using printed circuit boards in about 1974.
Yeah.
Right. The JMP era Marshalls are PCB.
Yeah. Right.
And like you think about the late 60s era Plexis, the JTM 45, and then into the, obviously the JTM 50, the JMP, the Super Lead era, all the way through to about 1973 were the last turret board amplifiers that Marshall made. By turret board, if people can kind of visualize what a turret board is, you might have seen pictures of gut shots of old Marshalls, and you see the main board, rectangular thing in the middle of the chassis, and it's got metal turrets that the resistors and the capacitors and stuff are soldered onto. right? And if you look at any gut shots of a Marshall from 1974 onwards, you don't see that. What you see is a green-looking main board. It's rectangular in shape. It's the same size, but it's green. It's a printed circuit board. And those very early ones were really fragile. Like they literally kind of crumble. By about 75, 76, Marshall had kind of improved the quality of the printed circuit boards, and they're still using the same style of board today. Completely fine.
Right.
But I mean, as Brad, I see Brad's just dropped something in the chat here, right? Good quality, well-designed PCBs is the best construction method in every way. Those that universally disparage PCBs are uninformed. I couldn't agree more, mate. This whole thing of fucking hand-wired versus PCB is just rubbish. People fucking smoking something. They don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah, right.
And
so I imagine it'd be more consistent, right? It'd be a lot more consistent. Yep.
And I always say, like, the term annoys me anyway, because it's like hand-wired should refer to how the amp was built, not what it's built with.
Sure.
Right? So if you want to talk about what it's built with, talk about point-to-point turret board PCB. Then have a conversation about, was this thing assembled by a machine with wave soldering, or was it assembled by a human being by hand? Right? And those two things have been mixed together by ill-informed people to mean, and they're trying to make it sound like the same thing, like hand-wired versus PCB. No. My amps are hand-wired PCB. Right?
Sure. Yeah.
It's fucking both.
Yeah.
I hand build them using the PCB.
Yep.
Sorry, it fucking annoys me, that one.
No, that's good to know, man. I've learned something because I had heard people spreading the whole hand-wired nonsense as well. But I'd also heard the argument about it being more consistent to use PCBs, and yeah.
Look, I mean, like Reinhold Bogner, who I think's a fucking absolute pioneer and a bloody genius, and what he's
an eccentric genius, I hear.
Eccentric genius, yeah. And I've never met the guy. I'd love to one day. But he's he's quirky and all that stuff, right? Which is cool, right? We want personalities.
Yeah.
But I remember, one of the great things that's happened and kind of the evolution of my little business is starting to get high-end amps sent to me for minor repair work and stuff like that, right? I mean, I've been able to have the privilege of restoring some old Marshalls and stuff like that now. I've done a lot of that kind of stuff, and that's always awesome. I love bringing those old things, not back to life. Some of them are brought back to life. Others I've just improved and given them a new lease on life. But you also get to look at, the best of what Freeman and Bogner and, I don't know, Diesel and any company, any name you want. And I'm always fascinated in the construction method. Like the circuits of what they're doing tonally, I don't care about anymore. I used to care. Now I just like, whatever. Like they're all just gain stages and resistors and caps, right? And you have your own formula that you come up with of sounds that you like, and everyone's got their own like little signature, if you like, or their own little thing, their own little version of what they think is a good tone. And so it's a subjective thing, and I don't really have any interest anymore in like, oh man, what was it? What's that circuit, man? What's he doing? I was like, well, I don't know, whatever. I don't really care. But I am super fascinated in the engineering. What sort of printed circuit board is it? How big is it? Have they got are the power tube sockets on their own separate board, or are they chassis mounted? That's the shit that I like to look at. Yeah. And going back to the Bogner thing, I remember the first Bogner Ecstasy that I had come in to work on, and this wasn't, by the time I looked at it, it's an old amp. I can't. It must have been a 90s. Not sure of the year of it, to be honest, off the top of my head. But this wasn't a new amp. I mean, the Ecstasy's been around for a long time, and this was a very early one. And it's all printed circuit board.
Yeah, right.
Like, you could not have more printed circuit boards in that amp if you tried.
Yeah,
And it's like that because it's necessary. That's a complicated amp.
sure.
It's a 3-channel amplifier with it's not MIDI controlled, but it has digital based switching in it, right? So it's got like, you can, like, the Ecstasy has its own foot controller, you know what I mean? Like, and you plug it into the rear of the amp with like a 7 or an 8 pin XLR style connector and so on. It's a complicated amp, right? And looking at that and seeing the I guess the technical excellence of what Reinhold had already done so many years before just blew my mind. And so, like, when people talk about the hand-wired PCB thing, I think I don't know, it's a weird conversation because you'll see the same guys posting in a different thread on the same forum about how much they love the Ecstasy,
Yeah,
or,
right.
or whatever, right? And,
Yep.
well, but you just said over there that you don't like PCB amps. So, I don't know, man. It's weird.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that just shows you that the internet does have a lot of people who are speaking as if what they're saying is the law, that don't really know what they're saying.
Oh yeah, no, yours is right, man.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you gotta sift through all that shit for sure.
That's one thing I always say to people about the internet. Whatever it is that you believe, if you look it up, you're right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, yeah, whatever
Yeah.
opinion you have on something, if you look that up, you're going to find evidence to back yourself up. Now, mate, when it comes to amps, is there a benchmark tone for you? Like, is there a sound that inspires you that you're going for? And what are you trying to achieve out of an amplifier?
Yeah, man, that's an awesome question. I think that, because again, it's a subjective thing, like one person's great tone is another person's
Yeah.
So we all have this thing in our brain which is like, well, this is what guitar of that style should sound like. And you might have a few different reference points in your brain, right? So, like,
Yep.
this is what a kind of clean tone should look like, a jazz tone, or hard rock and metal or whatever. But if you had to choose one thing, for me, it's that Marshall sound, and it's because that's the stuff that I grew up listening to. I've thought about this a lot, right? I'm trying to figure out, like, why do I like that guitar sound, but I don't like that one? And then I always come back to this, like, that's because those are the style of amplifiers or the style of tone that my influences were playing, right? And that's obviously, as I said, right, it's the early AC/DC stuff. It's that new wave of British metal. It's then, I guess, the torch got passed probably to more American-led stuff for me, but it was this is all pre-dual rectifier and all that shit, right? This is like, I mentioned, early Metallica, but then, driving a massive pathway through all that shit, pushing it all to the side, was Van Halen.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm kind of David Lee Roth era guy.
Yep.
I like the Hagar era, don't get me wrong, it's cool, and I'll listen to that stuff. But it's a bit like Bon Scott era AC/DC, it's like the David Lee Roth era Van Halen. That's the shit right there,
Yeah.
And all that stuff was recorded with that most famous 1968 100-watt Plexi. So I think, like, that's kind of a reference point. I'm not saying that all my stuff sounds like that, but it's that it is that kind of, let's call it a British sound.
Yep.
And I think when people and I talk about my peers in the business that are doing this, so I speak with other amp designers and people that are doing this same thing that I'm doing, and people will often use the term, a British sounding amp versus an American sounding amp.
Sure.
And I know what a British sounding amp is. And I've concluded that when people say American sounding, what they mean is Soldano and derivatives of, which means the dual rectifier.
Yep.
And it means the 5150. and a whole ton of shit that followed it that uses the same architecture.
Sure.
And that's that kind of a more of American kind of sound, right? So
Yep.
I'm more about the British sound, if you like.
Yep.
If you could boil it down to those two things. I mean, I like the SLO and all that stuff. It's all cool. But I find it a bit bloated in the lower mid-range, if I can say that. As I don't mean that amplifier, I just mean that kind of sound.
Sure.
I like something that's got more upper mid bark in it, you know.
And those amps that you mentioned also are very buzzy in the top end. I can remember,
Can be.
Yeah, I can remember back in the band that took out my hearing, borrowing a few different amps, and trying. I was for the longest time. I used to an ADA MP1 into a solid state amplifier, Carver was the light one, right? Carvin is what Steve I used. So I had I had one of those, a stereo one, with going through two Marshall valve state quad boxes. I try and avoid saying quad box because apparently it's only, you're laughing because it's only Australia that says quad box, right?
Fucking A.
Yeah. I remember talking to Thomas Blug, and he says to me, he goes, "There's a funny word you Australians use for 4x12." And I said, "For like a quad box? Why? What do we say?" And he goes, that. I said, "What? What did you just say?" I said, "Quad box." He goes, "Yes, you're the only ones that say that." And then I Googled it, and every fucking reference to the word quad box came back to Australia. So I avoid saying that. I avoid saying foldback because that's, again, the rest of the world says monitor. Right? And
that's so funny, man.
Yeah, and the other one is Mesa. It's only Australian. Some English people that say Mesa boogie.
Oh, Mesa, right?
Yeah, and that's taken me a while to get used to, but yeah. So that was the old rig. Was the MP1? I've still got one. Ooh, can people see that back there?
Yeah,
man. Camera in the way. Yep.
I can kind of see the blue.
Yeah. That's not the one. I actually got that one later, but I had one of those for the longest time. That into a quadriverb, into the Carver, and in hindsight, those valve state 4x12s that I had, they were quite a smooth sounding box speaker that was in it because, man, I've got a few cabs behind me, as you can see, and with vintage 30s and stuff in there, but that's a fucking harsh sound, man. It really is.
Oh, man, you probably had, I wonder if those boxes had, those quad boxes had T75s in them, because my Laney, I talked about that first Laney amp, the Pro Tube lead head, and with a matching 4x12. And it was only years later that I ended up taking the back off it and having a look at what was in there, trying to starting to learn about speakers, Celestians and all that.
Yep.
And they were the black and white, so the label was black and white, kind of like a half moon, black and white. GT75s, those speakers, man, it is the one speaker that divides the guitar internet. People love them or they hate them.
Well, right behind me, there's if I can get out of the way, that Marshall there.
Oh, there you go. Yep.
Has both. That's got GT75s and vintage 30s in it. So nice. I did a video because I've got another 4x12 over there. Can't see me right now over there. Where that had the GT75s. The one behind me had vintage 30s. I did a comparison video, which if anyone's interested can find on my YouTube channel.
Yeah.
And I think my description at the time was one was more of an E kind of sound. The other one was more aw. And then when you combine the two, you had it sort of widens the frequency range for me. So I've arrived at both in those.
I'm pretty sure the Bogner Uber cab, the Uberschall cab, which he has like a special spec 4x12 for that amp, is V30s and T75s.
Right.
Standard for that reason, and I spoke to so one of the great relationships that I've kind of been very lucky enough to establish in my little amp world is Joe Barresi, the
Yep.
record producer.
Yep.
And I've gone to see him a few times, right, in LA, but we speak occasionally on the phone, and I chatted with him a month or two back, and we got around to talking about speakers because it's just a great subject to pick his brains on. And we went through the whole Celestion range, and what do you think of this? What do you think of this? What do you think of this? I love V30s, right? Is kind of like his, the gold, kind of the gold standard, I guess. As a recording speaker, because he thinks everything that he speaks about is through the lens of putting a mic in front of it
Absolutely.
and capturing a performance. And V30 loves greenbacks, but finds that they fall apart too quickly.
Oh,
particularly as a lot of what he records is detuned metal. So he said, great speaker if you're Malcolm Young, or playing that, style. But he said for me and for the, the clientele that I've got, it doesn't really work. So anyway, T75 is his favorite speaker. I couldn't believe it because so many people freaking bagged that speaker.
Yep.
He's like, man, for heavy, like fast attack speaker that won't fall apart no matter what you throw at it in terms of volume and how detuned the guitars are, because he does a lot of detuned stuff, right? He goes, it's the one. So he said, if you ever find, I'm not sure about the new production ones, but he said, if you ever find some old ones that come up on the secondhand market, he said, man, grab them. And I was like, oh man, that's the speaker I had in my Laney, and that cab, I thought that cab sounded awesome.
Yeah, yep. Well, the Marshall Valve State ones that I had were something else. I think they were designed by Celestion. No, made by Celestion, designed by them. And it was just a very smooth sounding speaker in hindsight. Because now when I plug in the ADA, and it's funny, your ear matures as you get older and you start hearing things. So I hadn't played good amps. I went straight from playing a PV Studio Pro 112 to the rack setup with the ADA, and I just thought that was God, And I still get people saying, man, I remember seeing you back in the 90s, your guitar sound back then. I played in a group called Absolutely 80s with Scott Kahn from Kids in the Kitchen and Brian Mannix, all those kinds of guys, right?
Yeah.
I realized they played down around your way with a different band, but I'm in their Queensland band. And I can remember the first rehearsal I had, played one song, and Scott's just, and I had the MP1, and I had my Freeman small box set up as an alternative rig. And Scott, after the first song, said, oh, geez, your sound's a bit scratchy, mate. And I went and just hit the AB switch and flicked to the other rig and said, how about now? And he just looked at me and he said, why didn't you use that before? That sounds so much better. And now I hear that scratchiness in the MP1.
Yeah.
And I didn't hear that with those old speakers.
No, man. It's the same. When I had an ADA MP1, so like that was, that was one of the things I transitioned to after that Laney head. In fact, when I first got my ADA MP1, I was plugging it into the effects loop return of that Laney head, so I was using it as the power amp. And of course, this is, like, it was the dream, and all the guitar players well, not all, but there were a collection of guitar players around where I was living at the time. That all thought they were pretty good players, and some of them actually were. Everyone wanted an ADA MP1 because you couldn't open up a freaking guitar player magazine without seeing Nuno Bettencourt or Paul Gilbert or someone sitting there with their ADA MP1. And I was the same, man, because when I got that thing, I thought, oh, well, that's it. I got the tone now.
Yep.
But I've got one. I've still got my ADA MP1. It's in my rack right here. I'm pointing to it. I never turn it on and never play it because every time I do, I go, yeah. Lots of gain, but it's not really my thing.
Yeah. And it's funny. It's not until I got... Okay, so my old ADA died unceremoniously at a big outdoor festival I was playing last song, and what I didn't realize that there was 4 screws on the front that connected the whole rear of it to the front panel, and the screws had come undone, and it was just floating around in my rack, and it died last song, so I smashed it on stage. That was fun. And I went from that to the Randall RM4, which is the modular thing that Synergy now do. So invented by Bruce Egnater. And
Yeah.
I had some Randall modules, and I had them a modified one by Dave Freeman. This is when he was just rack systems, way before he had Freeman amplifiers. And I bought off him the SL Plus module that was a prototype for one for Steve Stevens. And that was just a game changer to me. That was the first time I plugged an amp. I would have guys come over and I would just play a drop D chord and let it ring out, and just the sprinkle of harmonics on top. I couldn't believe it. And just when I was sort of palm mute, just getting that definition.
What power amp were you using with that?
That was the Randall. I bought a rack that had the Randall preamp and power amp, and it took 2 guys to pick the fucking thing up. The only reason, like, I would have people say, "Hey man, come over for a jam." I'd look at this rack, and it was in a full floating hard case, and I would look at it and go, "Nah, I couldn't be asked picking that up to take it anywhere." It was that heavy. But that was a real ear opener for me in terms of tone. And that was thanks to Dave's modification. And I actually got the unmodified version of the module to do an AB. And people use the analogy of taking the blanket off the speaker. And that's exactly what it sounded like.
Yeah.
It was like someone had taken that off there. And that started me down the rabbit hole. I was quite happy being an ADA guy right up until that point. And then that made me want that clarity, but being able to channel switch everything the way I could just hit one button on a MIDI controller on the ADA and have my quad reverb and everything change as well. And that started the rabbit hole.
Yeah, well, this is it, right? And I mean, I think you can still, there's so many solutions out now, right? But I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there that I think has the flexibility that you need, but it just sounds better. I don't know. Like, I mean, I think that over time, people have figured out how to kind of, because there's all this thing. What I've found in the whole, the kind of let's call it the R&D that I've done in this stuff over the last, nearly 10 years, I guess, is that a lot of the things that you do that you might not think impact the sound actually do. So lowering the noise floor in the amp, so when I say noise floor, I mean, like, there's a lot of amplifiers that I work on that, old Marshalls and stuff like that come in, and they've got some problem with them where even with the volume turned down, the thing hums, a background hum. And where you turn the volume up and you got a lot of hiss or whatever, right? So there's things you can do that you learn about grounding and layout and shielding and other things that actually reduce and lower the noise floor of the amp, make the amp quiet, right? Mm-hmm. I never play with a noise gate, ever. Hate them.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I think I just don't like the way that they cut notes off, and that there's just an unnatural kind of decay on a note. And also, from a design perspective, I want to hear everything. I don't want to hear anything where the gate is masking characteristics, good or bad, in the amplifier. So as a result of that, I ended up working really hard on reducing the noise floor in anything that I was doing, because I didn't want to use a noise gate. But what I actually found is that not only did it make the amp quiet, which was much nicer to play, the tone of the amp improved.
Wow.
Yeah, like, I don't know, it's like maybe some masking in there from the noise floor, or just the clarity of what then comes out with all that shit out of the way.
Yep.
And going back to some of the stuff that you plug in that was new in our era, like you go back to the early 90s or whatever, when the ADA MP1 came out, maybe 1990, somewhere around there. It's pretty noisy, man. Yeah,
right.
And there's a lot of stuff out now that can, generate better tones, and the noise floor's near zero. They're way better.
Well, I've got the Synergy rack now that I'm going to use for gigs where I need to be able to pull off a whole bunch of sounds, just like the record, but mostly with the 80s band that I mentioned. with the actual lead singers from all those original 80s bands. A lot of people think I'm saying I play in an 80s tribute. It's like, no, it's the original singers. So they want to hear it just off the record,
Right.
and being able to have 4 channels to flick between. But
Are you using the Synergy direct, or are you through a power amp into a cab kind of thing?
I haven't been using it yet for shows with them. I did have a bunch of shows coming up in February, March, May, and that was going to be my first time using those. What I have been playing around town, funnily enough, is 2 little Vox practice amps in stereo.
Oh, right. Yep.
Little Vox Pathfinders. And everyone comes up to me afterwards and goes, man, your AC30s sound amazing. And I'm like, mate, an AC30's this big. Have a look again. My amps are only this big. But mic'd up with little 8-inch speakers sound phenomenal out front. But I'm thinking I'm going to run impulse responses out of my rig just for consistency, but as well have speakers on stage, because when I have tried using smaller amps or going direct, those guys come from an era where they want to feel it on stage. I remember doing a show with them and having my Freeman small box and having Dale Ryder from Boom Crash Opera beside me, and he kept tapping me, going, turn it up, man, turn it up, give it to me. He wanted to feel it hitting him in the back of the legs. So
it's a much better experience, I think.
It is. And you touched on that before about how we learnt to handle amps that are roaring at you, not, just coming back through.
Well, I mean, that's a whole thing that I think it's a technique thing that is learnt, people like, you can tell, right? You can tell a guitarist who's had to tame a loud amp, because the way that they can mute strings I'm not playing. Mm-hmm. They've always got one finger on the volume knob kind of thing, right? You're ready to, like, that's your noise gate, man.
Yep.
Fucking use a pedal, right? Yep. You know what I mean? Like, this kind of thing. So there's a huge part of electric guitar. I mean, this might sound silly to some people, but I believe is the amplifier is part of the instrument. All right. An electric guitar that's not plugged into an amp is just a bit of wood with some strings on it. Doesn't make any noise.
Sure.
Right? I mean, I know you can play it, but like, it just sounds pathetic, right?
Okay, I'm going to jump in here.
Plug it into an amp, and now then it's electric guitar.
I didn't have an amp when I first started. I grew up living in a caravan with just my mum, and she bought me that Onyx Strat. I didn't have an amplifier, but if I held the headstock against the walls of my caravan,
yes,
the whole caravan would take off. It would the resonance, and it was like playing through an amp. You would not believe how loud that was doing that.
I totally believe it.
Yeah, so that was my introduction of having a guitar with no amplifier. Yeah,
that's an acoustic electric.
I guess so. So, Jason, your line of amplifiers. What was the first amp that you released?
Yeah, the Alta 100.
Yep.
And so that was,
and that's still being made.
Yep. Just over 2 years ago.
Yep.
I put that out. Like, it would have been late 23. I can't remember. I'm getting these years mixed up. Anyway, it's been out for just over 2 years. Mm-hmm. And that I spent a year working on it before I kind of like put it out for sale, if you like, like put it out and then people could order it or buy it or whatever. I spent a year prior to that working on it, multiple iterations of a prototype amp. And I just kept, I kind of worked on it. I mean, I still had a full-time day job back then. So it wasn't like I was working on this thing, 60 hours a week or anything, but in terms of elapsed time, it was a year, and I'd work on it in every spare moment I had, outside of doing family stuff and obviously my day job and all that. This was what I did. And I was well into printed circuit board design by then. Because I never actually got onto that, but you asked me about the kit stuff, and I did, it's a separate thing. And my daughter now runs this online store. We have an online store for hobby builders. It's called evolvediy.com.
Cool.
And on there, I've got printed circuit boards that I've designed that allow DIY builders to mod or build your own amp. They are geared towards people that are ready to, maybe it's not the first amp that you build, but if you're ready to kind of like take the next step and start to assemble an amplifier where it's not a kit where everything you get is in the box, more like the second stage of learning where you go, well, I want to build a 2-channel Dirty Shirley style amplifier myself, and you assemble some bits and you build this thing yourself. Then we have a circuit board that you could use that would help you build that. And we've got a bunch of ones, like you just got a modded Marshall stuff, Jose style mod amps and shit like that. So that I'd already kind of got into doing that, and so my printed circuit board design skills were coming along okay. I still obviously never stopped learning, right? But had already done a bunch. So when I set about doing the Alta, back to that, I did the first revision of I designed the circuit online. It was based on mods that I had developed for Marshalls. It's a Marshall style amplifier, like back to that American British thing. It's a British style amp. And so I started to incorporate Marshall mods that I, kind of arrived on as things that I liked. And I started to incorporate them into an amplifier. And my test case for this amp was, what do I want for a live amp? Right? What do I want in an amp to play live? And I want to be able to cover a whole lot of ground.
Yep.
So I need clean tones. I need edge of breakup. I need, crunchy rhythm stuff. I need high gain, tight rhythm stuff. And I need searing freaking leads, and I want all that. And I want it all switchable, like I want to be able to kind of like, I don't want to switch between different rigs. I want all that in one amplifier. And so it was, this took time because what I found when the first incarnations of that amp, when I first got the first prototype running, was that the functionality worked because I had it's a MIDI controlled amp, right? So you can store presets in this amp. The MIDI doesn't store, it's not like an ADA or whatever where you can store parameters like the bass and the treble and the gain or whatever. It's not, it's all analog circuitry, right? So the pots are just normal pots, but you can store the state a bit like you can in, I guess, a Synergy rig, like where you can store what channel you're on and what, there's like diode clipping off and on, and there's voicing switches and vintage modern mode and all this kind of stuff can be stored into a preset. And that was this whole thing about, being able to recall different sounds to cover everything that I would want in a live amp. And what I found when I first got this iteration 1 going is that functionally it worked, but every time I changed from one tone to the next, I felt the need to go and re-EQ the amp.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Like, because some of the modes were shared on the same channel. So you run channel 2, which is like, you can channel 2 and the amp is like, I'm thinking about, how much gain channel 2 has, similar to a BE channel.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a BE channel, but it's like, in terms of the amount of gain it has, it's similar, And channel 3 is similar to an HBE in terms of how much gain it has, you know what I mean? So it kind of like gives you an idea. And channel 1 is like a plexi clean channel, But so I got this vintage modern mode switch, for example, that you can activate. So channel 2 can run in vintage mode or modern mode. And then when I'd flick between the two, it's the same, it's sharing the same EQ, treble, middle, bass, presence, whatever.
Yep.
And I'd change modes and I'd go, it's too bright, and then I'd re-EQ the amp. And so a lot of the work in that development cycle was tweaking that circuit so that when you flick between the modes, I no longer felt the need to grab the knobs. It's kind of like that's how I know when the circuit's right, because I just start playing guitar and I forget about I don't have to reach for the knobs. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But that's the test case. I realize I've been playing for 20 minutes and I haven't touched the amp, then I know it's good.
Great.
You know?
Yep.
So yeah, that was the first amp that came out, and it was kind of like, I guess I realized pretty early on when I started to think about all the things that I wanted in that amp and that it was going to be 100 watts. I thought, well, this is going to be your flagship model. It's going to have to be, right? And then everything else you do beyond that, which I didn't even know what I was going to do beyond that, but I realized that it would probably fit around that amp, and that amp would still be the, I guess the flagship in the lineup, and that's what's happened so far.
Cool. So you mentioned the Evil Joe as well. So that's another amp. How many other amps have you got in the lineup?
Just those two.
Just those two.
Yeah, I had other amps before that, but they got kind of superseded. So I was doing this amp called a Kelly, which is kind of a Jose mod. Yep. Yeah, so the Evil Joe superseded that kind of amp. The Evil Joe was like that Kelly on steroids, basically. So it's like it didn't make any sense. And the Kelly, it was never an amp that I really bought it out as a production model. It was a thing that people could custom order. So I did a bunch of them. I probably did, I don't know, 20 or more of those, over a couple of years. And they were just done. People would just contact me and say, man, can you build me one of those? And then we would, what Tolex do you want? Do you want 50 or 100 watts, whatever? They were kind of custom built. Okay. But the Evil Joe, when all that happened, that superseded it. And now it's a standard model. And when I say standard, I mean, it's a 50 watt EL34 amp. It has its features. If people contact me and they say, can you make me a 100 watt Evil Joe? I'm like, no, that's not. It's a 50 watt amp. Yeah. I got a 100 watt amp. If you want to talk about that, that's a different amp. But and like, could there be an Evil Joe 100? Well, maybe, but not yet. Yeah, that doesn't exist.
So Joe prefers 50 watt amps.
Yeah, well, like that whole thing when that happened. I mean, so he built himself a Plexi from a kit.
Cool.
Right. So he's just an engineer or a producer that likes to understand how things work, on the basis that if he can understand a little bit about how all the stuff in his studio works, then he can extract unique sounds out of it. It helps him dial things in, because he's got an understanding of what's going on, rather than just aimlessly tweaking the knobs, hoping for the best.
Yep.
And so he wanted to teach himself more about how tube amps work. So he bought himself a Motortone 100 watt Plexi kit, built it, got it working all by himself. Then he wanted to mod it. And that's when he discovered me, because he came across my YouTube channel where I have a whole stack of videos showing how to mod shit, basically,
Yep.
Mod Marshalls, pretty much nothing else is on there, mostly just Marshalls. And, and there's a lot of stuff on there about Jose mods and, what a Jose mod is, how to actually do it. I've got long, boring videos that show you what components to change and what ones to put in and why they sound the way they sound and all this kind of stuff, right? Like a guy, I actually did a mod for a guy just a couple of days ago on a 1959 hand-wired reissue. And he came around and got the amp day before, maybe yesterday. And he's like, he'd only recently kind of found out about me and what I was doing. So he said to me, he goes, man, I started watching some of your videos on YouTube. And I was like, okay. And he goes, you've got some good ones where you kind of actually demonstrate sounds, like, and you play and stuff. And he goes, I like those ones. He said, and you got some other ones where it's all circuits and stuff, and you talk about all this stuff. And I went, yeah. And he goes, yeah, it's a good cure for insomnia. I was like, yeah, man, that's a special audience for those ones. But so anyway, Joe found the channel, God knows how, and then I got this message from him on Instagram. It was early. Oh man, I was trying to think, but it must have been 2 years ago now, close to 2 years ago. And it was just a message from this, I get messages all the time and emails 5 or 10 a day from random people who I don't know saying, I've got this Marshall blah, 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 and I want to do this mod. What do you think? Or I just picked this amp up secondhand and it's making this buzzing noise, like whatever, like all kinds of stuff. And like, you help where you can, and other times you just run out of time and you don't. But when I got this message from him, I was like, oh, here we go, another guy asking about Jose mods, which is pretty common. But I had a close look at it, and I was like, Evil Joe Barresi was the, name of the dude. And I went, because I'm a big fan of Tool. I've been listening to Tool forever. And I was like, fuck, Joe Barresi. And then I thought it was a hoax. And then I looked at his profile and realized it's completely legit. So, of course, I, started being very helpful to Joe, and we started chatting about all this stuff and helped him with his mod. And he implemented all this Jose shit. I put an extra gain stage in, he put some clipping diodes in, and got this amp of his freaking ripping, because I got to hear it. When I first went to actually then visit him a number of months later, that amp that I'd helped, well, he did all the mods, right? But I'd kind of helped him with try this and do this. I got to play through it, and it sounded awesome. But what actually happened was he then said to me, this is back in kind of January, February, whatever it was, 2 years ago. He said, well, you should just build me an amp. So I did this one-off custom amp, and it was based on the Kelly. So this is why the Evil Joe superseded the Kelly, because my starting point for that amp, which was only ever meant to be a one-off, was I took that Kelly kind of starting point, and then we evolved it into what he wanted. And he wanted some different options. He wanted another higher gain mode that could be switched in, and so on. And he just wanted certain functionality. And I had assumed that he was going to ask for 100 watt. Because, of course, I was doing those to order. So you could easily do 100 watt, no problem, And he said, I want a 50 watt amp. I was like, oh, wow, that's interesting. I said, man, why is that? And he said, well, I think they record better. I remember him saying that, straight up. And I was like, and he's like, having been to his studio a couple of times and spent hours playing through his amp collection, because it's kind of what you do when you visit Joe. He starts bringing out amps and you just play through them, right? And he's got the biggest collection of tube heads that I've ever seen.
Wow.
In one location, There's so many. You can see at least a few videos, like on Steve Fryette's channel. There's a couple of videos that they posted where Steve restores an old high watt that Joe's got. And I think in the second video, it's filmed in Joe's main room, because Joe's got his own studio in Pasadena.
Yep.
And it's filmed in his main room, and you can see all the shit that he's got in there. And you can see the wall, the amp wall, and it's shelving, I don't know, four or five shelves end to end on the end of this room. And there's so many amps that end on.
Wow.
You know what I mean? Like, they're not turned so you can see what they are. You can only see the end of
just
it. So you've got to recognize the amp by looking at the color.
Has he got a bit of gaffer tape with what it is written on there or something?
Yeah, there's a bit of that.
Yeah.
He just knows what they are. He goes, oh, he pulls it down, and of course it is what it is. And then what you can't see in the video was that's the short wall of the main room, and on the long wall of the main room are just quad boxes. And on top of those 4x12s, 3 or 4 heads stacked.
Wow.
It's everything. He's got Wizards, Bogners, Old Marshalls, all the Mark Series amps, he's got dual rectifiers, he's got 5150s, he's got everything. And it's because it's a working studio, he's got all that gear, because he never knows what tone will be needed in the moment. So it's all there, and it's all working, and it's all ready to go. So
listen to the sound of the records he's producing, though. It's obvious that he's got some tools at his disposal.
It's really interesting talking to him about digital modeling and stuff as well. Mm-hmm. It's not a long conversation, because he kind of he has no interest in it. It's not like something. It's not a topic that he wants to talk about, because it's like he just finds it irritating.
Yep.
I don't know if that's the right word, but it probably is. He said to me, I looked around his studio, and it's just all analog gear. Everything. Including his console. He's got an old SSL console, it's the biggest freaking console I've ever seen. It just wraps around the room, this thing, right?
Yep.
And he's constantly maintaining it to keep it going, because it's just like it's things needs constant life support, But everything is analog in that studio, and he's got like a Pro Tools rig, and he's got some stuff in the box,
Yep.
And I asked him about all that, and he goes, "Well, sometimes I use that, but man," he goes, "I have a very simple philosophy, which is that," and he goes, "This applies to digital modeling for guitarists as well."
Mm-hmm.
He said, "Everyone's using the same fucking thing. What is the point?" Like, he goes, "Literally, what is the point? You're going to use the same plugin that 5,000 other people are playing?" And I said, "I know you're going to dial it in and your own little guitar or whatever," but he goes, "Fucking pointless." I was like, man, he's like, "Man, this shit," and he's pointing to his wall of like rack analog outboard gear.
Yep.
And then he's like points over to his rack of fucking tube amps. There goes that. Each one of these things has its own personality. And he goes, "I can produce a sound in here with this gear that no one can reproduce because it's not a fucking plugin."
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was really, I was like, oh my God, this is so on point,
Yep. Yep. And it is true, man. I hear people who use Axe effects and it's the same freaking sound, and I hear it straight away, and there's this frequency, this kind of sound about it. That
same amp model.
Yep. There's your gent bloody Axe effects preset there. Yeah. Man, I'm gonna have to reach out to Joe. I reckon I'd have a great old chat with him.
Man, he's awesome. He's done some. I think he's done. I mean, I should get him on my buddy channel one day. He's done a bit of this stuff. Like, you look around on the internet, you'll see there's a bunch of videos with him in conversations like this, just talking about stuff.
Yep. Yeah. I'm gonna hit him up. So you mentioned the Alta 100. Is that what Jim Root's using?
Yes.
Yes. You must be just talking about the bands that you got into metal, thrash metal, and stuff quite young. You must be absolutely fucking chuffed that Jim Root from Slipknot is using your amplifiers.
That was one of those moments where you go, "Fuck, did that really happen?"
Yeah.
And it's still, I mean, even now, like I still think like that. Like, man, did that really happen? And it happened real quick and out of the blue. And it was when the band, so they had Knotfest. It was March 23, so nearly 2 years ago. So the Alta had been out for probably 6 months.
Yep. And
Mike Smith is the guitar tech for Mick Thompson. Mike is the founder and owner of Omega Amps. And they have, they've got two models. They've got the model called the Granifier, and the Obsidian is the other one. So they're a Michigan-based amp company. I've met a couple of the guys that work with Mike. There's, 3 or 4 guys working in the business. Great little amp company, right? And Mike actually kind of cut his teeth. He's a real speaker guy, actually, speaker and cab guy. And they grew the business from there into amplifier heads.
Yeah, right.
He's also, as I said, he's the guitar tech for Mick. So when they go on tour, Mike's out on the road with the guys, obviously. And I'd already met Mike, not in person, but we chatted a bunch online and stuff, because it was one of those things where, like these small independent builders, this is one of the great things that I've found really surprised me about this industry, is how welcoming and helpful everybody is. Blew me away, man, because I came from a corporate environment where, like, the competition is the enemy. It's like it's just not kind of done in the corporate world. Whereas this is like, I was really surprised at how, whether it was like people like Dave, Dave Freeman and others have just been, Bruce Egnater is another connection that I've made. Like, all these guys are just so helpful.
Yeah. Yep.
Blowing me away. I was like, man, these guys, they're all like, we're all in this together, man. This is all, it's great. We help each other out, and it's been amazing. So Mike was like that. He and I had connected because, we kind of been talking about stuff, and, maybe he could help me on things and maybe I could help him on stuff. And anyway, he contacted me a couple of days before they came to Australia for the Knotfest tour that they were doing. and he said, I'm on the road with the band. We're in Indonesia at the moment. Coming down to Melbourne in a couple of days, we should actually meet. And I said, well, that'd be amazing, And then on the morning, they flew in. The very next day, he pinged me on Messenger, and we were just going to go and catch up for lunch in the city. We're just going to go into the city, and because they were staying in the CBD. And he's like, "Have you got one of your altar heads there? And if you do, would you be up for bringing one in?" And I'm like, "Why the fuck would I bring a head in? Like, what are we going to do? Go and play it or something?" And he's like, "No, Jim wants to try it." Yeah, and I was like, I nearly went Jim who, I mean, I was like, because I couldn't. Do you mean Jim Root? Come on, man. And I didn't obviously say that. I was like, but I did say, "Are you serious?" And he's like, "Yeah, I've spoken to him about it. He wants to try it." And so I owe Mike a huge debt of gratitude, because without him saying to Jim, "Hey man, this is what happened," right? When they were traveling down to Australia, he said to Jim, "Hey man, there's this new amp from this guy in Melbourne that I think you might like it. If I can organise it, would you like to try it?" And Jim apparently said to him, "Well, who is it? What is it? And Mike said, "Don't worry, you never heard of this guy. You just don't worry about it." He said, "But are you interested?" Yeah, I'll try it out." So that's how Mike arranged it. And so that's when he said, yeah. So a couple of days later, he messaged me, "We're going to go out for lunch." He said, "Have you got an amp there?" I said, "Yeah." I had mine. Like, I just shipped out. I just built a couple, but they'd been shipped out to, buyers. And so the only thing that was literally here ready to go was my amp that I was using, serial number 0, first one.
Yep.
I was like, "Well, I got mine here." And he's like, "Well, you want to bring it in?" I was like, "Okay." So I handed it to him. We had lunch and had a great time and all the rest of it. I handed him the amp at the end of it. I never saw it again, because 2 days later, Jim had tried the amp out backstage. So they have, like, every time they gig, they have a jam room set up somewhere backstage where the guys can go in before the show and play.
Yeah.
Because they don't sound check or anything. This band is one of those bands that have been together for 25 years or whatever. They just turn up and play.
Yeah.
All right. And what they will do is they'll get in there and kind of like have a bit of a hit out and play, like stretch their legs, I guess, before they then actually walk out and play the show.
As you would with that kind of music. Yep.
Yeah, so there's a drum kit. I mean, Mike's telling me all this shit, right? And I was like, "What's this fucking jam room, man?" And he's like, "Man, so the guys have rigs set up, amps and cabs. There's a bass rig, a drum set, and all that shit goes on tour with them. So no matter where they are, they can go into the jam room and warm up and play through real amps and go for it." And so he said that's what we did with Jim. It was the Friday of the gig. They set the amp up. Jim walked into the room and apparently just started playing it. And then Mike's messaging me in real time. At this point, I was on my way out to the show, right? Because I was going to see, Mike had got me on the guest list, and I was going to go to the show and actually watch them play. And Mike's like, "Hey, Jim's playing your amp." Oh, fuck. Right. What does he think? and I'm waiting. And then Mike comes back and he goes, he literally said this, right? It blew me away. He goes, he loves it. He says it's the best amp he's ever played. He wants to buy it. How much? That was what the response was. And I didn't know how to answer the question, because I was like, how much? What? So I just said, I said, he can have it for free. He can just have it, right? If he's wouldn't mind doing some promo stuff, maybe, not endorse it, right? So that's a different thing, right? But at least, say that he's using it, or fucking give me a photo with him with it, or anything. Yep. I'll take anything.
Yep.
And I'm waiting for the response, and then 5 minutes later, Mike comes back on the Facebook chat and says to me, no, he goes, no, he wants it, but he wants to pay for the amp. He doesn't want to take it from you for free.
Yeah.
Which was kind of how it's been with him. Like after that. So he took that amp, and I've never seen it again. He's ordered 2 more, so he's now got 3, and he paid for every one of them. And all of the contact now, I mean, I have some contact with Jim, and he's been amazing, awesome. Most of the kind of the contact in terms of what he needs and what he might want or whatever is through his guitar tech, Brad Clifford, who's on Instagram. Anyone who's listening to this should look up Brad Clifford, because he just posts all sorts of really interesting stuff. He's a touring guitar tech. He does all kinds of. Jim's his main guy, but he works for other bands as well. It's always really interesting shit that he's posting. So, yeah, man. So that's how that happened, and now he's Jim is the whole band is kind of they've set up lighter weight rigs, kind of fly rig style stuff, right? Mm-hmm. So he's still got his 100-watt heads and all that shit, but they put together lighter weight rigs. So they asked me to build a preamp for him.
Cool.
Basically a single rack space 3-channel MIDI preamp, which is the Alta's preamp. Like my 3-channel 100-watt head.
Yeah.
They literally said to me, could you do a tube preamp for Jim that is that amp, all tube, MIDI controlled, 1 rack space, which I did. I worked on that for about 6 months, and he's got it, and it was featured. They did it. The guys had just been through Europe, and there were a couple of rig rundowns just posted in just late December, maybe early January. Mm-hmm. And he's using a quad Cortex based rig now on these tours. I think they're going to do I don't know 100%. I think domestically in the US with their home base, they're still going around with their big 100-watt heads and shit like that. But when they're kind of flying in and doing dates, they're using these lightweight stuff.
Yep.
And the preamp is in the rack. It's only been one of them. So, but I've actually just put together the second prototype, and I want to bring that out as a standard offering.
Wow, man, I'd be really interested in one of those. I said it got the synergy and stuff, but yeah, I'd be man, if you do come out with a production line of those.
Well, it's rack, man. It's really interesting. So, I'm speaking to the guys that like Brad, particularly, Jim's tech, and I've spoken to other guys that work in the industry at the kind of pro level, like the touring level. Because you can kind of segregate. Like, I think about this in terms of the market. I got to think about it's great to come up with products that I love and that I would want to use, but I've also got to think about, well, will anyone actually find it useful? So when people talk about, when I was first thinking about rack preamps, I'm like, oh my god, is there a market for that? But the more I've pushed into it, the more I've realized that in that pro touring segment, or guitar players that have techs, they're all moving to rack-based gear.
Yep.
Right? Because they need lighter weight rigs. So this whole thing about, the convenience of modeling versus heavy transformer-based tube amps and all that rest of it. There's some practicalities that we all need to face in terms of the reality of the cost of touring and all that kind of shit, right?
Yeah.
And what I've realized in all this kind of research, and what I'm, I guess, hopeful about, is that whole market segment is opening up, mostly in the pro area, and then you've got enthusiasts at home that have rack gear because they just love it. But there's a pathway there, right? Because if I can make it, I've thought to myself that if I can successfully get a great sounding, flexible, tube-based preamp in rack format, then it's only another step to then do that in a pedal format. It's changing the real estate,
Yeah, sure. Yep. And that's quite popular. That's quite popular now, is having preamp style pedals, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, we'll see what happens, right? This is still in development, but the idea with that product is that I ideally we'll be able to bring it to market with with a built-in digital back end. In other words, power amp sim and IR loading.
Yep.
With the tube pre all in one unit. So you could take that direct to PA if you wanted to, or you could obviously run it to a power amp and into a cabinet if you want to as well. But like to make that ultimately useful in a whole lot of scenarios, I think it really needs to kind of have like, it's a bit like, like boutique amps and Freeman are already doing this,
Yeah. Man, what you're saying about having IRs built in and everything. My credit card number is
yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So you've mentioned a lot about guitar techs actually, and a lot of the guys who are teching. I've actually just scored a gig. I'm going to be guitar teching for Jack Jones, Erwin Thomas, in a couple of weeks.
Oh man, wicked! That's cool.
Yeah, on their Queensland run.
Say hi to him, man. He's been here a bunch of times.
Awesome,
with some of his amps for me to work on. Yeah.
Yep. Well, they're starting their Australian tour up this way, and I'm doing the Queensland shows for him. I'm really looking forward to that. Actually, Jack's been a big influence of mine when I was a teenager. It was, if you would have asked me who my favorite players were, I would have cited him as being my favorite Australian player. So
I can understand why.
Yeah. He's tasty but can pull it out when he needs to. Yeah. So really looking forward to that. And he's going to be using a rack. I've been talking to Jack about that, and he said he's leaving the heads behind, but he's bringing up a big rack.
Yeah.
So it definitely is
photos of that rack. He talked to me about it. So Simon Cotter, Simon's might be ticking for him when he comes down here.
Yep.
Simon's like a Melbourne-based, amp builder and tech that is mostly now touring as a backline tech, and so he's like, I think most recently was the tech for Russell Crowe's band.
Yep. Chris Gonzalez is playing for him, right?
Yes.
Yep.
Exactly. So he was teching for those guys. When Living Colour came through on their last tour, for example, Simon was teching for Vernon Reid.
Oh, wow.
And this kind of stuff, right? So anyway, Simon built that rack.
Nice.
For Erwin.
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, man. No, that sounds like something I'd be totally down with trying, is that rack preamp of yours.
Yeah, well, man, it's I've teased a couple of photos of it on social media, and I like, look, we'll see. There's still quite a lot to do in terms of kind of like finalizing the design, and then getting some, I need some stuff to be custom fabricated, like the rack enclosure.
Yep.
Like obviously in a prototype, you don't go to a manufacturing company and order 100 units or 1,000 units. You hand build one, and you get everything working, and you prove it all out. I've done all the printed circuit board design because I can do all that myself. So I've got the whole thing's operating, and it's like all the MIDI stuff is working, and tonally it's already done because it's my Alta preamp. Like, I didn't have to change the tonally. It just, as soon as I fired it up, there it was, because I just replicated exactly what I'd already done.
Yep.
The challenge now is incorporating the digital back end, the IR loading and all that stuff, and having that work seamlessly with the analog, the tube part of the product.
Mm-hmm.
And then, working with some engineering firms to get, enclosures fabricated with, with all the graphics and everything that needs to be on there, so, but it will happen, we're still in January. I've got time. It'll happen this year.
Cool.
Is the plan.
I'm looking forward to that, mate. Really am. Hey, you talked about modeling before, and you said how Evil Joe isn't really a fan of modeling.
No.
I can hear it a mile away, and we're saying about Erwin bringing up the rack and everything. The last time I saw Erwin, he was playing with the fabulous Caprettos, and I went and saw the gig straight after the show. First thing he said to me was, "How's my tone, man? I trust your ears. I know what you're talking about." And I said, mate, it sounded good, but still sounded like a modeler. But he was really curious. He's like, how could you tell? And how can I fix it? And there's some dead giveaways for me. And I'm interested to know, can you hear the difference between amps and modelers? And if so, what it is that gives it away for you? I wonder if it's the same thing.
Yeah, man, that's a really interesting question. So, look, my experience with this stuff is when I play, so sitting here at the desk that I'm talking to you on, I've got 2 studio monitors up right here.
Yep.
You know, like left and right of me, pointing right at my ears. And, you know, I've got an Axifix on my desk here, and I've got a Quad Cortex sitting on the ground here on my pedal board. And I can fire up a modeling rig just like that.
Yep.
And I do use them when I'm playing through here, and I can actually take a tube amp through a reactive load and through an IR and play it through these same speakers.
Yep.
And I can get the digital modeling and the amp that's loaded down and then through the same IR to sound pretty similar, man, like through studio monitors, you know, like, in other words, it's kind of like a recorded guitar tone.
Yep.
You know, and when it's kind of down at that level where it's like kind of sanitized is the term I would use. Because it sounds like a recorded guitar tone, you know, it sounds like something that's coming off a CD or a Spotify or whatever it is, you know.
Yep.
So it's kind of sanitized, and so they sound to me, you know, pretty close, you know, like whatever. But where the whole thing becomes, for me, modeling completely falls apart, try and make that loud. All right?
Sure.
Now, you try and take that same model and make it loud even through a guitar cabinet.
Yep.
It doesn't feel the same. It doesn't sound the same to me.
Yep. I've tried running
me too.
Various ones through cabs, and no.
I tried the whole FR thing when I had a Kemper when they first came out, and I was determined to try and make it work. You know, what a waste of fucking time that was. Again, great thing to have in the studio and play through your monitors. Cool, you know, it's fun even.
Yep.
Try and play that in a live band where the other guitarist is using a tube amp. Forget it, man.
I did exactly that. I was, this was Axifix. What was the floor thing? Was it called an AX8 or something like that?
Yeah.
And I bought one of those, and there was a 2-week return policy on them. The band I was playing in at the time, the other guitar player had a dual rectifier, and I tried running the AX8 through my Fryette power station power amp and through my boxes. And the other guy would play, and there was just no comparison. There really wasn't. But then as soon as I ditched that and brought my Freeman in, I felt sorry for the other guy, because as soon as I'd play a note, everyone would just turn to me and go, "How's your fucking guitar sound, buddy?"
Same, man. Same experience, man. Like I went back. I mean, that my little kind of foray with trying to use a model live like that, and it was in a band that, you know, it was a band that most of what the audience was hearing was coming off stage.
Yep.
You know, kind of old school loud backline 4x12s. You know, not plugging through an array. You know, like a hung fucking array PA or whatever, right? It wasn't like that at all, right?
Yeah.
Like, you know, there was shit coming through front of house, but a lot of the guitar noise was coming off the stage. So you needed something with, you know, that would cut and had presence or whatever.
Yep.
And I tried, you know, maybe 2, 3, 4 gigs persisted with this thing. And then I went back to using a 50-watt tube head that is actually one of the early amps that I'd been working on.
Yep.
As my own. Like, I was just trying different things in this amp. And I turned it into a 2-channel, like I had a clean and a gain channel. It was Marshall-y, you know. And the instant for the first bar of the very first song, I just went, there it is.
Yep.
Like, all of a sudden, my sound was back.
Yep.
You know, and it was like my experience, even if I was using the Kemper profiler into a tube power amp, into that same 4x12, it still didn't work. And so, I don't know, man, like, your question was, what is the difference in the sound? They just sound flat. I don't know. There's the dynamics is not there to me. It's
Bang. You just said the word. So when Owen said to me, how's my sound? And I said, mate, I can tell you're using a modeler. And he said, how? And what can I do to improve it? Listening. So a lot of people are listening to modelers, and they're listening to the tone, the EQ of it, and they're very close. What they're not listening to is the dynamic. And I used to work in music stores years ago, and I know one of the jokes is the most returned pedal is a compressor pedal. The amount of people that bring it back go, it doesn't do anything. You don't know what to listen for. And in fact, because I'm in the production world as well, a lot of my heroes freely admit that they worked in studios as an assistant for a couple of years before they could actually hear what a compressor does. So to hear dynamics is you got to tune your ear to it.
Yeah.
So if I jump back to the first time I got an Axe Effects 10 or 15 years ago, I was doing a record for a friend of mine, and it came time to do the guitar sounds, and I just got an Axe Effects 2 or something back then, and I just could not get it to sit in the mix. If I got it to where it should sit in the mix, where I could hear the sound, you couldn't make out what I was playing. If I turned it up to where you could make out what I was playing, it was too loud and it was drowned out everything else.
Yep.
So
100%.
What I say to people is dynamically, I speak very visually when it comes to sound. You probably do too. I find a lot of people who are in the game, either guitar amps or mixing, speak in visual terms. For me, you set something as being the sea level, like you're looking at an ocean, and the snare generally dictates for me where the root level is, where the ocean sits.
Yep.
And a real amp has just this little bit of dynamic at the front, just the front end of the note is like the shark fin that just pops its head up. And it's the difference between going, oh, there's something murky in the water over there, I wonder if that's a shark, to, fuck, there's the fin, there's a shark, right?
Yeah.
I know that sounds stupid, but
no, but I know what you
that's
mean.
the truth. And it's just that little bit, that transient at the front of the note isn't there on the modelers. And then the next thing that somebody who's flying the flag for modelers will say to me is, but in the context of a mix, it doesn't matter. And that's where I just shake my head and go, mate, that's where it matters the most. If you play them on their own, yeah, it sounds really good. You're listening to the tone. You're not listening to the dynamic of it. But that little bit of transient that's missing is the difference between your ear finding the sound and having it make sense. And this is where I go back to where I first got that Randall rig, and I had the modules modified by Dave. And people would come over. My friend Tony was guitar tech for Pink for a few years when she was doing the huge big world tours. And so he knows guitar sounds. He had, he was looking after Justin Jericho's rig. And I can remember him spinning out, just go, fuck, listen to that. It was like you were inside the sound as opposed to looking at it from the outside and going, well, what's going on in there? It was like you're inside it and you could look around at all the particles. It's just that extra 3D thing. And once you hear it, there's no one hearing it. And man, for a while there, when I was going to the gym, I'd put on my headphones and I was listening to Lamb of God. Those guys, I mean, the drumming and their guitar sounds just next level. Then I would try and put on, what's that band from Byron Bay that's doing really good overseas? Parkway Drive.
Oh yeah.
And they use Kempers.
Yep.
And I couldn't listen to it because I wasn't in it. It was like a plastic thing from the outside. I'm trying to look at it. And I got some other friends who are in a really big Australian metal band that I'd done some stuff with years ago, and they've started releasing music again. Axe Effects, again, it's that same argument of, yeah, I can hear it. I can't make out the intricacies of what you're playing because of that tiny little bit of dynamic that's missing.
Yeah,
That's my take on it.
Look, I actually don't understand. I mean, I understand why people use them. Don't get me wrong. Like, super convenient, lightweight, whatever, right? It makes a lot of, on all those measures, it makes sense. But what I don't understand are big touring bands that have budgets where there's players, guitar players, that are choosing to use this stuff over a real amp. And I'm not saying that they're wrong. I mean, that's their choice, right? They want to do it. Metallica.
Yep.
They're doing it for some reason. I don't understand what that reason is, because personally, I have never had, that's what I said before about they all sound great and are sanitized. When you put it down into a studio monitors or whatever, they kind of like everything kind of sounds similar. You try and make that thing loud, and to me that just falls apart. And not only does the sound fall apart, but the experience for the player falls apart. So I am a believer, and I said before, about an electric guitar without an amp, just a bit of wood with some string on it. So when you plug an electric guitar into a good tube amp and it's got some volume, doesn't need to be crazy loud, but some volume, where you then have a feedback network that exists between the speaker and the pickup, and you get interaction happens, right, between the guitar and the amp. We've all felt this. We know what that is. That's the whole experience of playing and creating, and if you don't have that, if that's not there because you're using a modeler and you're direct to the PA and you're in-ears or whatever, or even you've got a cab on stage and you're using a power amp, to me it's still not the same interaction that you get, with power tubes through an output transformer. You're just missing out on what it could be.
Yep.
Why you would choose that for other than convenience, I just don't get it.
Metallica, that really baffles me, because I heard they went Axe-Fx and they were saying for consistency, I think the story I heard was they went to play in Antarctica and they figured that their tube amps wouldn't do so well in the cold and everything, and just became so convenient that they stuck with it.
It's probably because they're using Mesa Boogie.
Yeah, right. So,
not necessarily the most reliable things, but
yeah, right. Now, I saw a live thing come up on YouTube of Metallica since they went Axe-Fx. Now, big part of that sound is Hetfield puts in so much effort to downstroke all that. And there's a big fucking difference. Like, I see guys who go to play that and they're not downstroking, and it's like, wrong, doesn't even sound close. And I was disappointed, because what his downstroking brings is that extra pop, that that makes
it's a sound.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm watching him and I'm thinking to myself, dude, you're putting in so much effort right now to not be able to be heard what you're doing. It seems criminal. It seemed like a step backwards. I'm sure there'll be some haters out there that'll say, oh, mate, Joe, why would they do it? They know what they're on about. But for the end listener experience,
I can only assume that there's something about that him and Kurt find very appealing, other than it's lighter weight or whatever.
Repeatability.
These guys could afford the freight.
Yeah,
to
absolutely.
cart around a few heads, not that much more weight,
Yep.
I mean, the size is the same. An Axe-Fx is a 3-rack unit high device. You can rack mount a Mark Series amp. It's 4 rack space high.
Yep.
There's no difference. It's a little bit heavier. That's all. Right. So it doesn't hold up to the argument that it's lighter weight. So this is all about freight. So it can only be that they find it more appealing to play or sounds better. And I mean, and that's their view, and you got to respect it, but I don't understand it.
Yeah.
Because I've never found one that does.
Yep. Another one for me was, I went and saw Steve Vai when he was out here. A year or so ago, and he brought his rig with the Synergy, and he had and his sound was 3D. It was like it was floating in front of the speaker. his second guitarist and his bass player were both using Axe effects, and his second guitarist, man, that sounded like a billy goat pissing on a tin on a mountain very far away. It didn't have that floating in front of the speaker thing. Bass player went to do a big bass solo, and all you could make out was this rumble. There was no definition, none of that clarity coming through from a real amp. So yeah, it really does baffle me when people tell me, it's just as good, and hasn't been my experience. Man, I've had them all as well. I haven't had a quad Cortex.
The quad is cool, but I mean, it's like a next generation Kemper, I guess. The thing that appealed about the quad, the reason I have a quad Cortex is because I use it almost like a notepad, in that if I've come upon a new, because I mod stuff still quite regularly. People send me Marshalls to mod. It's part of what you do, and I continue to do that because I still find it enjoyable, and it's a way of, you can discover new sounds or circuits. Like it's an R&D. There's an R&D angle to that.
Yep.
When someone will, I mean, I've arrived at a number of mods that I can kind of repeat out of the box, almost in my sleep now, right? But occasionally you try something slightly different, or someone wants something slightly different, because I'll always ask the player. They might say to me, "Hey, I heard this thing on your YouTube channel. I want that." So that's easy, right? Okay, I'll replicate that. But sometimes you'll have a conversation with the player, and I'll say, "Talk to me about some of your favorite guitar players or favorite guitar tones. What are they? And do you want the Sam to come back to you sounding like that?" So that gets you you can get in the ballpark then, right, of what kind of tone someone's looking for. It's back to that thing. What is that sound in their head that they, for them is a good sound? And so by doing that, you can, that's kind of an R&D thing with the modding thing, where you can kind of discover new sounds and new circuits. And so I will document those by taking some photos and maybe making a few notes, but I'll get my quad Cortex and I will take a profile or a capture of that amp before I send it back.
Yep.
So I can kind of go back in my little library of captures and go, that amp that I might have only done one of, it's just a photocopy of it,
That's a good idea. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's why I got it. And I've ended up using it. So when I play live with my Alta 100, because I use that amp, right? That's my live amp. I still use the quad Cortex, but I just use it for effects only, just for pre and post effects, because it's just convenient, because everything's just in the box. But I don't use the amp models when I'm gigging. I use.
Yep. Now I've got a Helix rack sitting right here with the Synergy. And that's my streaming rig, or I'm going to use that for demos and stuff, just so I can very easily flick between Fender, Vox, and Marshall style circuits to see how different things react, even though I've got a whole bunch of amps behind me there with an amp switcher. But I'm just using the Helix for effects and as an interface to get it in and out, so I can go direct as well into my recording setup. Yeah.
Sweet.
Yeah. If we got people still watching, I'm going to round things up soon with Jason. If you've got any questions, please feel free to chuck them into the live chat. I did highlight a couple there, mate, that I might find. What did Bernie have to say here? Bernie said, "How do customers know which PCB is good or bad?"
Yeah. It's a good question. I mean, look, generally speaking, most stuff that's been built today is great, actually, right? There is some stuff that is probably less than great because it's there's a tendency to, like this whole thing about reissue amps. Marshall are a little bit guilty of this.
Mm-hmm.
The new Mesa stuff I haven't seen in person yet, so I can't really comment. Like the reissue 2C Plus and the reissue dual rectifier. I haven't seen those in person, so I can't really comment. But there are some companies that are reissuing things today, and they're still, as part of the reissue process, they're using the construction method of something in the 70s, and they probably just shouldn't. Like reissue it with the same circuit, so it still sounds the same, but you can, a modern printed circuit board that is manufactured using the latest machinery and technology, it's all done in China, right? These things are bulletproof, man.
Yeah, right.
Like the stuff that, the PCBs that would be manufactured in the 70s were brittle, and like not ideal. But you think about how technology has evolved, the whole digital age has happened, right? Everyone's walking around with these printed circuit board, right? Our whole lives are dependent on printed circuit board technology. It's not hand wired, using that stupid term again. So, but if you're really curious about that stuff, then you could post on. There's some good amp groups around. I don't know if you're on Facebook or not. You don't have to be on Facebook, but there are some good kind of amp bulletin board forums style thing, like the Amp Garage is one that's sort of around. There's Rig Talk is another one. Well, that's kind of a bit more metal based. That one, Slow Clone, is a bit tech. There are some amp groups around. Like we have the DIY group. So I mentioned evolvediy.com, which is for hobby builders and so on. That's a Facebook group. It's got about 3,000 to 4,000 members in it, I think. And Alex and Brad, who was in the chat here, and I admin that. There might be one or two others. It's a DIY group. It's a group for DIY builders and hobbyists. Anyone can join that group and post a question about amps. So cool. You can just do your research, right? There's people out there that are prepared to comment on whether something's good or bad. As I said, 95% of it's great.
Yep. It's funny that in the recording world, a lot of people asking about converters. Oh, should I upgrade this converter, that converter? And it's like, dude, they're all good now. Back in the 90s, it was a different story, but now the cheapest ones you can get are going to be better than what some classic albums from the 90s were done on. So yeah, technology's looking really good. Now, Bernie, the
thing that makes a good, sorry, just my closing comment on that is like, so printed circuit board, and the thing that makes a good printed circuit board actually is the layout.
Okay.
The physical placement of the components on the board. Like what the board's made out of, how thick it is, how thick are the copper traces and all that kind of stuff. Those are little variables that, there's no reason why people can't get those right, because you literally tick a box and you say, I want 2 ounce copper and I want it to be 2.4 millimeters thick and whatever, right? That's when you order it, you send the fabrication files out to the PCB house. It's all online, right? They've got websites. You load your files up, you tick a few boxes, and you say, give me 20 of those, A week later, they turn up on your doorstep. That stuff is easy. The hard stuff, and this is important for audio circuits, because you need to minimize crosstalk, interference. There's shielding considerations and all this kind of stuff, right? So you have a low noise floor. That's mostly to do with layout and so on.
Yeah.
And that's where, a good amp can turn into a shit amp, simply because the layout of the components on the printed circuit board mean that there's channel bleed and other annoying things in the amp that drive you nuts,
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's all about the layout. Nice. So Bernie also asked about how good or bad are the new Gibson amps. I'm wondering if he's referring to the Mesa amps.
Oh, maybe.
Now. Yeah. And you just said that you haven't had a bit of a look at them.
Know. Look, I think on all accounts from what I've heard online, they sound like they should. I think the internet, the guitar internet, probably knows that the launch of the 2C Plus was a bit of a dog's breakfast, but it's probably been rescued by Ola and a few other high profile YouTubers that have managed to dial the thing in and get decent tone out of it.
Yeah.
They sound like they should, and they come from the companies that own the intellectual property for those things, so they bloody well should sound good. So, and I think I've seen a few photos of the insides of the 2C Plus. There are some photos online. The construction method looks pretty faithful to the original, which not necessarily a good thing, because some of those amps they're notoriously hard to work on. Like,
Sure.
I know Brad was in the chat here before. I mean, personally, I will not take one of those amps in and work
Really?
on it. No, I won't. A Mark Series amp. I mean, I own one because I just want to have one. It's kind of like a reference tone,
Yeah.
But I won't take them in to work on because
Wow.
they're just, everything's just crammed in there and it's hard to get to, and like they're just difficult things to work on. And I've kind of I just thought, nah, I'll take old Marshalls in. I love those old amps and I know them backwards now, so I'm happy to do that. But honestly, I want to spend most of my time working on my own stuff now, rather than trying to figure out how some thing that was built, 30 years ago was put together and try and fix it for someone. It's not how I want to spend my time. So
Yeah, right.
yeah, look, but I know they have changed some of the parts that they're using internally. They've modernized, so they're using kind of like, much more kind of contemporary filter caps and stuff like that. So they're probably okay.
Uh-huh. But speaking of the 2C, I did some demos of all the different Synergy modules, and when the 2CP came across, and I'm thinking, oh, this is going to be great. This is what these guys use it, get this really tight sound. It sounded broken to me.
Yeah.
What's the trick? Yeah. Do you know? Is there a trick to dialing those in that I just don't?
Look, I haven't played with that Synergy module, and I have, I think there is a certain formula definitely for dialing those amps in. But perhaps one of the things, and this is where the Synergy thing can be difficult to nail the head completely. Now, the power amp in a tube head is incredibly important in terms of the overall character and feel and sound of an amp. The preamp alone generates a good chunk of the tone, and particularly in high gain amps, right? High gain amps generate their overdrive and distortion and a lot of the harmonics and stuff in the preamp. So you can put that into a Synergy module and replicate that, not even replicate it. I mean, you can actually have it. But then when the signal then passes to the power amp and the power amp does its job, the design of the power amp in terms of its characteristics, and it's everything from, they might have the way the presence circuit is wired, the depth, on a Freeman amp, you have a thump,
Yep.
I mean, I have a depth knob. Some amps have a thing called resonance or whatever. That's kind of like, it works like presence does, but it's on the sub-bass frequencies,
Yep.
And then you have this thing called negative feedback in a tube amp. Some amps have no negative feedback, and some amps have a truckload, and that changes the whole characteristics of the tube amp in terms of how lively it feels, how dark it might be. It can be like dark and tight, or it can be wild and lively, or somewhere in between.
Yep.
The output transformer characteristics that, again, the output transformer doesn't necessarily have a tone, I believe, but it does. What it's doing is it's reflecting. You get this thing called reflected impedance, if you've heard that term. Your speaker has a voice coil, right? Most people might know this, and a voice coil, it's not a linear thing. In other words, the frequency response of that thing is actually dependent on the frequencies that have been pushed into it. Low frequencies, okay. Mid frequencies, high frequencies. It's called reactance, right? So you get this, again, a tube amp connected to a speaker. The output transformer is the thing that connects the two, right? So on one side of the output transformer, your power tubes are wired to that, right? The primary side of the transformer, and on the secondary side of the transformer, the speaker's connected to that. And the job of the transformer is to move that electrical energy between the power tube and the speaker.
Yeah.
But it's a two-way system. It's like water in a pipe, there's a push-pull thing. Like,
Okay.
it's not just one way. You're not just like pushing it out and the tube amp doesn't care about what the speaker's doing. It does care. And this is part of the magic, I think, like you talk about why does the tube amp behave the way it does and why does it sound the way it does? Well, it's this whole kind of ecosystem that's connected together. That's not discrete components that operate in isolation. So, going back to the synergy thing, it has, you can connect it to a tube power amp, and that tube power amp will have an output transformer and it will connect to a speaker. So it has all those things, but that's set. It's one formula of that, whereas the amp that you're trying to replicate might have had a completely different power amp design.
Sure.
That's why it sounds different. So the power amp design and the synergy, I don't know what it is, but let's just hypothetically say it's a Marshall style power amp. Then the Marshall oriented modules are going to sound amazing with it because they're built for each other.
Okay. Yeah.
Right? You put a Mark series thing onto that Marshall style power amp, might sound funny.
Yeah. Okay. Totally makes sense. Absolutely makes sense. And it's funny you say about the different power amps and how they react. I was saying about my old ADA setup back in the 90s. I used to use that through the Carver power amp, as I mentioned. But when the Baby Animals came back from opening for Van Halen, they did a run of shows around Australia, and PV had decked them out with 50-on-50s. And then I was working in a music store, and we got the chance to buy those 50-on-50s on the cheap, pre-used. I got my hands on one, took it to rehearsals, went to play it. Everyone went, that sounds crap compared to your ADA. It's got this weird, fuzzy, buzzy sounds.
Yeah.
Then I used my ADA and used just the power amp section of that 50-on-50 going into the effects loop return, and which gave me access to the resonance knob on there.
Yeah.
Fuck me dead. That's the best I've ever heard, that ADA sound. It sounded thunderous. It gave me that extra octave of low end that I thought I was missing on my setup.
Yeah.
And so that
it's,
really
it's
opened my
enormous.
eyes.
Like it's a, for the stuff that I've done, and the business partner I work with, Shay, like he's from Monomyth Amps, so he's based in Indiana in the US, and has become, a really important part of Headfirst. And so our two companies, we're both solo builders, right? We help each other out on all kinds of things, and it's really developed into a partnership and a really great friendship too, actually. He reminded me of this the other day. We were chatting about this stuff, and we were talking about, because we get asked from time to time, you're going to do a synergy module. I get asked this quite a lot. Well, that's not up to me, right? That's up to RV and boutique amps and all that stuff, right? That's a whole different question. But Shay and I were talking about this because he gets asked quite regularly as well, and he's like, man, he goes, I wonder what we would do if that ever happened. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, both my stuff and your stuff, he goes, what we've designed, it's the power amp is a huge part of what we're doing. You know what I mean? So if you just have the preamp by itself and it's mated to some third-party power amp, then it's not going to sound like your stuff. Might sound good, might be great, but it's not going to sound the same as your head.
Yep.
Necessarily. So it's interesting, right? As soon as you break these things apart, it doesn't necessarily replicate the amplifier that it's trying to replicate.
Yep. I see the Dr. Z module that came out has, I think they describe it as having a mini power amp style circuit going on in there. And,
this is it, right?
Yeah, out of all the Vox style preamps that I tried of theirs, that definitely sounded the best for me. The others were a bit too clean.
Yeah, that's quite cool. Like what they're doing there is like, when you have non-master volume amps, like an old Plexi or, the Vox amps, the Fender stuff, any amp that you can think of that just has a single volume control on it. Mm-hmm. Like that's how a lot of amps were, right? Or still are. Like a lot of modern things have gain and master volume. Well, before all that shit happened, you just had a volume, right? You just had one thing, one knob. And when you turn it up, the amp would break up and go into overdrive and distortion, but by then it's ungodly loud. So what you're doing there is you're overdriving the power amp. So you're getting kind of power amp overdrive at that point.
Yep.
So when you try and reproduce that in a preamp, not easy. So that's what those guys have been doing, right? I've spoken to Dave about this, and it's it's clever, right? Some of the stuff that they're starting to do in that synergy world is to replicate the characteristics of a power amp, but in a preamp tube.
Yep.
Yeah, not necessarily an easy thing, and probably hasn't been done all that well, So it's like what they're doing is kind of breaking new ground there. It's pretty cool.
Yep. I have one final question for you, and
Sure.
that's I kind of touched on it before. Just what it is that you're trying to achieve out of an amplifier that is the perfect amp for you. Like, I know when I'm testing gear, I laugh when I see guys going, "Oh, how does this one sound? How does this one sound?" It's like, how can you tell? I'm sitting there chugging on an A chord, just going gung, 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 and I'm listening to the pick attack, whether it jumps forward, whether, just a few little things like that. What is it in your head that you're listening for?
I mean, for me, it's got to evoke that, and I go back to what is that DNA that, all that, it's that kind of thing that's in the back of your brain or the front of your brain or whatever that is that's what a great guitar sound sounds like.
Yep.
It's got to have some of that in there, like it doesn't. I'm not looking to reproduce that one for one because that's already been done, right? Like if you want to reproduce Malcolm Young's sound one for one, then get a Gretsch and a super bass and turn it up and you're off and you're running. You know what I mean? Like, but it's got to have like that guitar sound has to have some of that in there for me. But I like versatility in it, so I want it either versatility in the amplifier or versatility in the one tone where it's super responsive to what you're doing on the guitar.
Yep.
Whether you're changing the, rolling the volume back or you're moving between guitars or how you're playing, it's got to be evident in that tone. And I want clarity. Like I like gain. I mean, I like high gain. Don't get me wrong.
Yep.
But I want it to be super clear.
Mm-hmm.
If it's kind of sounds muddy and it's like it just sounds like a big blob of whatever, to me that's not back to the drawing board, right? Back to the workbench. Change it. It's like it's got to have clarity, right? So I'm looking for that. I mentioned before about that upper mid kind of like I do like that, and that's to me amps can get. You start to lose clarity where there's not enough of that upper mid range and high end.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think there are amplifiers out there that I find too dark.
Yep.
Right, where too much of that top end is just, in my opinion, has been rolled off, and they become a bit polite.
Yep.
And they lose a bit of kind of that aggressiveness and that cut, and they can still have a lot of gain, but it's all kind of mid and lower mid. And so I'm looking for, and I think that there's a fine line there in the high end where you get cut and clarity, but not ice pick.
Sure.
There's that, like, that's something
It's a fine line. It's a fine line.
It is a fine line. I'll work on that real hard, right? I mean, I had a guy, I mentioned the guy came around yesterday and picked up that hand wire that I'd worked on. It was the first thing he sat in this room and played it, right? So I wanted him to play the amp before he picked it up and took it away. I wanted to show him kind of like, well, this kind of how you dial it in, The first thing he said, he goes, man, all the high end is there, but it's not harsh. And I'm like, yeah, that's, I'm not saying I get it right all the time, but that's what I'm looking for. I want the top end to be there, but I doesn't want it to make you feel like it's hurting,
Yep.
Yeah.
Wow. So one of the tests I do when I'm trying amplifiers, high gain amps, is I play like extended chords, not just your root and fifth kind of chord. Typically I'll go for an F sharp minor, but with the open E and B string on there.
I know exactly what you mean.
And the amp will either reproduce that E and B string, or it'll just turn to cat hiss. It'll just go and not be able to play those notes. It just turns into this weird kind of dissonance. That's one of the things that I look for. And it's surprising, man, it's night and day. Some amps completely, I just cannot hear those two strings. And I'll be showing my friends, I'll be playing this note going, listen, I can't hear that. Flick to a different amp, bang, there it is. So that's another thing that I'm looking for.
Totally.
Jason, I've never played one of your amps, right? Man, but I'm really looking forward to trying them one day. I just hearing where you're coming from, and I think I could be a convert to the Headfirst sound.
Well, that'd be awesome. Yeah, man. So you're in Brizzy?
Gold Coast.
Gold Coast. Okay, cool. Yeah, man. I'm sure we can get one through your way at some point. I was going to be, Lamb Chopper, guy up in Townsville?
No.
Check him out on YouTube, man. He hasn't posted for a few weeks now, but he's so his YouTube handle is Lamb Chopper 678, I think. He's raised in Melbourne actually, but he moved up to Townsville in his 20s. Lived up there most of his life. He's got a massive channel, more than 150,000 subscribers.
Wow.
Yeah, heavy metal guitar guy, great player.
I'll have to check him out.
Great player, awesome dude. His name's Anthony.
Yeah.
And I did a mod. He actually sent me his studio, the Marshall SV20, the baby plexi.
Yeah.
And I modded it to this mod, and we've since called it the Lamb Chopper mod after his nickname. He got this nickname at work because he told me that in his lunch break he would play guitar and he was trying to learn all these Lamb of God riffs.
Okay.
And so one of his workmates who didn't know who the hell Lamb of God was would say to him, "What's this? What are you trying to learn?" And he said Lamb of God. So he got nicknamed Lamb Chop. Anyway, that's how his channel is called Lamb Chopper. But anyway, man, I want to get an Evil Joe up to him to demo.
Yep.
At some point, and if that happens we're already in the new year, aren't we? But maybe in February, March, then we might be able to get it to come through you on the way back or something like that.
That'd be awesome. That'd be awesome. I've just fired the channel back up. Told you before, just some of the issues that were holding me back from posting content over the last couple of years. But yes, I'm catching up on a few things that have been sent my way, and hopefully, once he's done, he can send it down my way. That'd be awesome.
Man.
I'd love to.
Yeah, we'll stay in touch on that. I'm sure we can do that.
Jason, thanks so much for your time, man. I've really enjoyed the chat. Yeah. Anyone that's watching, these are available as audio only podcasts on your favorite podcasting sites as well. If you did stick around and watch it all, a bit of a like, sub, all that kind of thing, it goes a long way. And I thank you all for tuning in, and thanks again for Jason. And we'll see you guys later. Thank you. Bye.